Good morning, everyone. It's 9 o'clock and we'd like to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us this morning in this event to learn more about the issue that really affects us all. My name is Ana Jivanovic Nenadovic and I'm an Assistant Director of Policy for the North Carolina Coastal Federation, and I'm coming to you live from our office in Ocean, North Carolina. The Coastal Federation is a nonprofit organization that works to protect and restore the coast of North Carolina. And we do that by collaborating with and engaging people from all walks of life who are passionate about the coast and who are committed to keeping our coast healthy for the current and future generations. And really, ever since the beginning of the mass production of the plastics in the 60s, the plastic has really permeated our lives in every single way. It's in our water, it's in the ocean, it's in the animals, it's in the air, it's even in the space. It appears about 6,000 tons of it. And so at the Coastal Federation, we like to, and it's a problem. And at the Coastal Federation, we like to tackle problems. We like to try to find solution to those problems that affect our communities and our coast. And for that reason, we try to organize these events, such as this one, to share the latest scientific findings and policy ideas with our community and our leaders. And this is a critical step in informing future management decisions that make a difference in protecting and restoring the coast. This forum is the first step in our effort to inform the public and galvanize support for the change that will hopefully lead to solutions to microplastics. We not only want to share the latest scientific findings with you today, but we also want to inform you about the impact and the magnitude and really the ubiquity of microplastics in the environment. And we will also discuss today potential solutions and strategies and some critical next steps with the ultimate goal of really developing a path forward and catalyzing that change that we want to see. And we're really fortunate to have an impressive group of presenters with us today who have all volunteered their time to share with us some of the truly remarkable work that has happened in recent times in research, regulatory, and outreach context of the microplastics. And with that, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items since we're all in this virtual platform. As attendees, your microphones and your cameras are turned off so we can't see you, but we would definitely like to hear from you. So I encourage you to keep asking questions and making comments throughout the event, even if the presentations are going on. We have a few minutes for questions after each presentation, but feel free to ask questions throughout the entire event. To ask questions that are for technical problems, please use the Q&A feature, and for any comments or questions for the presenters, please use the chat box. And if you'd like to go ahead and open your chat box and look on your right bottom corner, I'd like to invite you to please change the default from just chatting with panelists to chatting to panelists and all attendees. In that way, we can see your, all see your comments and your questions. I also encourage you to use the chat box to introduce yourself and tell us, where you are and what you do. I myself like to know who I'm chatting with, so hopefully you do too. We have over 300 registered today, people attending, and a lot from all over our country, but also some around the globe. And I hope some valuable connections can be made during the event. We are very happy to have so many attendees, but we also understand we won't be able to answer all of your questions, but we're committed to working on with our panelists to answer any questions that remain unanswered after the event today. And we will share those answers along with other resources that we have collected on this topic with you via the email you have used to register for the event. So without further ado, Bonnie Monteleone is going to kick us off with an overview of the microplastics problem. As the Director of Science, Research, and Academic Partnerships for Plastic Ocean Project, as well as its Executive Director, Bonnie Monteleone is a researcher who has collected plastic marine samples globally, including in 4 of the 5 main ocean gyres and the Caribbean. She also works in the Environmental Studies Department at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington as an adjunct instructor, teaching a plastic marine debris field studies course, and manages a lab working with student-directed independent studies research. Research projects vary from field work, collecting beach samples, to lab analysis, working at plastic leachates, persistent organic pollutant uptakes, and plastic ingestion by marine organisms. Bonnie is also an accomplished artist, turning some of the plastics she collects on her voyages into modern artistic masterpieces. She received the Conservation Communicator of the Year 2017 Governor's Award, Cape Fear YWCA Woman of the Year Environmental Award 2018, and was nominated for the Cape Fear Woman of Achievement Award in 2018. She's a member of the Sierra Club Marine team and sits on the North Carolina Wildlife Federation's Board of Directors. Welcome, Bonnie.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to discuss microplastic research and discovery, a topic that has commandeered my conscience since 2008. And thank you, North Carolina Coastal Federation, for inviting me to be your keynote speaker today before this stellar group of speakers and panel. So just a little background about Plastic Ocean Project. It stemmed from research I had done as a graduate student at UNC Wilmington. I started my field research in 2009, and my thesis question was, if plastic is accumulating in the North Pacific, is it happening in the North Atlantic? And the results of my research as a graduate student revealed that there is an estimated 3,855 metric tons of microplastics. And we're talking about plastics no bigger than 5 millimeter or smaller. And though we could not directly compare the results to the sampling we did in the North Pacific with Captain Charles Moore, that of which I joined in 2009 with his resampling of the North Pacific. Based on a publication he wrote in 1999, where he revealed that there was 6-to-1 plastics to zooplankton. He has not yet published his data, but he did count the amount of plastics that we collected, and though the number of plastic particles were lower, he said that the plastic particles were actually much larger. So you may have heard the plastics in the ocean is not actually creating islands of trash, but it's more like a plastic soup. And so therefore, Charlie Moore has labeled the North Pacific as more chunky. In 2010, I joined 5 gyres Institute that were sampling all 5 of the gyres in order to get an estimate of how much plastic was floating in the world's ocean. I say ocean singular because you can look at this diagram and see that it's really just one ocean connected by currents. And their research revealed that there's 5.25 trillion pieces of plastic floating on our ocean surface. And again, this is relatively old data as it was published in 2016. And I was fortunate enough to join them on the first transect ever across the South Atlantic, leaving from Rio de Janeiro to Cape Town, South Africa, another 30 days at sea. And sadly, every single sample that we collected, just like in the North Pacific, just like in the North Atlantic, had plastic particles in it. And then in 2012, I joined former members of the BBC that were doing a documentary called A Plastic Ocean. And I flew to Fiji to run my surface sampler as well as dissect fish. And if you want to learn more about the results from that, you can see that film on Netflix. But all of this work that I had done made me realize that I wasn't going to just be able to write my thesis and defend it, that I was going to have to start a nonprofit in order to help address this issue. And so therefore, our motto is education through research, where we get children as young as 5th grade in our lab working on research projects. We help them design them, as well as have students from high school, undergrad, and graduate students helping us with research projects that we have developed. And of course, the biggest challenge with this problem is education and outreach. So the way we can educate the masses is through storytelling, and storytelling is through the arts. Therefore, we have to have documentaries written, we need books published, we need writers, storytellers, and artists in order to convey just how serious this problem is. And then solutions through collaboration, and a great example of that is our ocean-friendly establishments, where we have over 255 businesses that are committed to reducing their use of plastic. So I had mentioned that we are doing surface sampling, and what we're using is a manta trawl, and it's called that because it kind of looks like one. It has a wide mouth and short fins, and the mouth of the manta trawl is 1 meter across by about a 1/2 meter deep. We use a net associated with it that's 333 microns, meaning that you couldn't even stick a straight pin through the holes. And we travel at about 2 to 3 knots, and then we vary the speed anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour. And the reason why we have to do that, especially in the North Atlantic, is because we have a free-floating algae known as sargassum that will fill up our net. And so we lots of times have to shorten the length of time in which we run our sample. So as I had mentioned, the ocean is turning into more like a plastic soup. So this is the results of what we find when we run our surface sampler. Now, how long have we known about this problem? Well, it appears that the evidence of plastic becoming a problem started revealing itself in the 1960s. And this was a book that was published in 1983, and it was explaining all of the negative impacts that these plastics were having on the marine environment. And this book is still available today, and I would encourage people to read it to get a really good understanding of, just how dire the situation has been for a very long time. Today, we are seeing, there are reports, or scientists are reporting, that it's now all seabirds that are negatively impacted by plastics, and that roughly 300,000 marine mammals are affected by plastic each year. And that does not include the work that was done by the World Wildlife Fund that estimates that we're losing 300,000 cetaceans to bycatch alone. So I love this animation because, yes, indeed, we used to intentionally dump plastic in the ocean. And the cartoon reads, if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of garbage being dumped offshore. And of course, he's using a can like a seashell. And so the progress is that in 1988, recognizing that this plastic that we were dumping in the ocean was actually washing back up on our beaches, an international law went into effect known as the Marine Pollution Act. And so you can see the date, right, 1988. So it took a good 20-some years for us to get to that point. So how did we get to this point? Well, this quote was taken from a book called The Waste Makers that was published in the 70s. And in it was quoted Victor Lebeau, who stated that our future economy needed to be based on this. Our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and the use of goods into rituals, that we seek spiritual satisfaction, our ego satisfaction in consumption. We need things consumed, burned up, and replaced, and discarded at an ever-accelerating rate, which translated into design obsolescence and the dawn of single-use plastics. Oh, and by the way, this quote was from 1950. So we now have the newest member of the food web. because plastics break up, not down. They're breaking up into smaller and smaller particles, making them more bioavailable for all the organisms in the ocean. So I like to call it the big small problem. Now you can see I have a series of stacked sieves here. So the larger particles are in the top sieve. The volume appears to be getting bigger in the second sieve because it's taking up more space. But then as the particles get smaller, we start to see less and less of them. And scientists are really concerned to where these smaller particles are going. So there was research done at Plymouth University that actually proved that plankton will ingest plastics. So they fluoresced plastic particles. They then subjected them to plankton to see if they would indeed ingest them. And here's one of the images that they captured. Now, this has been replicated by work done by Dr. Susanne Brander and Dr. Alison Taylor at UNCW, where they produced a video sharing the same results, sadly. And if you'd like to see that video, you can see it in the documentary, A Plastic Ocean. That research then led to a grant proposal with NOAA Marine Debris Research Grants. And our question was to look at the trophic transfer of legacy compounds up the food web. And we have 2 publications that have come out of that, and you can find them if you search for Samantha Athey et al. 2020, and most recently Cheyenne Steinbarger that just was published this year. And you can see the results of our work. So what do we know about North Carolina freshwater and microplastics? Well, Plastic Ocean Project acquired a new instrument that can detect plastic particles down to 10 micron. And with that, we're able to collaborate with more people and more universities and nonprofits. And 2 of the projects we're working on right now is with NC State and 15 Riverkeepers. And as research goes, the more you learn, the more you find out you have to learn. And this instrument was able to detect 1,046 plastic particles that were positively identified as plastic. Those are a lot of P's out of 1,598 tested. And that led to an average of 35 particles per sample, which, we don't associate microplastics in freshwater. And what we're learning from this is that the plastics operate much different in freshwater than they do in the open ocean. And a lot of that has to do with salinity. So we're now finding those microplastics sink at a faster rate, and we're finding them more in the sediment than actually on the surface. The other interesting thing that we're learning from this work is that the chemistry of the plastic actually changes over time as it degrades. So it just is another opportunity for us to conduct more research. And then, as I had mentioned, we're working with North Carolina Riverkeepers, where over the course of 2 years, we'll be collecting 480 samples. And to date, we've tested 500 particles, and 228 of them tested positive for being plastics. And then the others, oddly enough, we're finding all kinds of things like pharmaceuticals and narcotics. So again, another opportunity for more research. So what's at stake? Well, knowing that we have all of these plastic particles and that they are now being exposed to everything from plankton to the largest animal on the planet, which is blue whales, we have a lot of work to do on mitigating the amount of plastic ending up in the ocean. Sadly, the number of plastic by ton that's ending up in the ocean, that number has just jumped up to 11 million metric tons. And so we're really still going in the wrong direction. Even though we have been putting laws into effect, we still have a lot of work to do. There's been a study that was done on a series of publications on marine animals negatively impacted by plastics. And that publication revealed 693 species. And of course, that number is probably much larger, and why we need to continue the research on plastics in the ocean. And we haven't even begun to look at what's happening to our terrestrial animals. But probably what I find most disturbing is what's happening with these chemicals in plastics and how they migrate into food. And a report that was put out in 2018 by the American Academy of Pediatrics is pleading with our government to start really mitigating the amount of chemicals that are put in plastics, because they can and are having a negative impact on our children. Because their metabolisms run much faster, they stand a much higher risk of being affected by the chemicals that are known endocrine disruptors. And these endocrine disruptors can actually cause obesity, diabetes, behavioral disorders, cancers, and reproductive issues. Other reports that have been done on the impacts of plastics on humans was conducted by the Center for International Environmental Law. You can find this publication, and they're basically saying that this plastic is affecting us both from extraction all the way down to plastic waste management. So we have a lot of work to do. So some good news is the fact that because we are conducting all of this research, and the research that you're going to learn about today, we can now put more laws into effect in order to reduce the amount of plastic that's ending up in the environment. So you can check this out. It's called the Break Free from Plastic Act, and right now they're trying to push that legislation. Other good news, the Save Our Seas Act, that is now 2.0, so that is now a law that's addressing plastic that is in the ocean. And then probably the most promising news is the UN Global Plastic Pollution Treaty. And this is where we're finally, just like we did in 1988, we can come together to really start working as a world effort to take on this plastic crisis. So the solution has to be circularity. So no, Victor Laveau, it can no longer be linear. We have to start figuring out ways to repurpose any of the waste that we create, and also figure out ways to make things safer. So today you're going to hear from Dr. Scott Coffin and Susanne Brander, and they're going to be talking about the chemicals associated with these plastics as well as the leachates. We're going to hear from Emily Sutton and Dr. Sarah Morath. So Emily does amazing work. In fact, she's my go-to for the 15 river keepers. So she's herding the cats, as you will, getting all the samples together so that we can study them. And then we really need the storytellers, like I had mentioned. And Sarah has come up with a great book called Our Plastic Pollution. Other things that we need and people we need to hear from are like Sarah Latshaw from NOAA Marine Debris Program, where she's helping find the funding for research as well as solutions. And then what I find most promising, and I really look forward to hearing from, is Dr. Richard Venditti and Dr. Marielis Zambrano, who are coming up with alternative materials using plant material in order to get what we need, but it works with nature instead of against it. And together, all of this helps to protect our resources, nature, and our economy, because all of this can drive towards a stronger economy for our country while protecting our people and our planet. Thank you.
Dr. Monteleone, thank you so much. My name is Michael Flynn. I'm the Coastal Advocate from the North Carolina Coastal Federations, joining you today from our Northeast office in Wanchese. I want to welcome everyone attending from across the globe today. It's very impressive seeing what's coming in the audience in the chat today. Dr. Monteleone, to start things off today, when I was listening to the presentation, ubiquitous and omnipresent were the two words that came to mind when listening to about the threat that all of these little plastics are posing to the globe. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit about the Ocean-Friendly Establishments program that you mentioned as an opportunity to reduce some of the inputs that are coming into our waters?
Yeah, I'd be delighted. This was a program we started in 2015, and to be honest, we had to beg establishments to want to get involved. But once a couple of them climbed on board and realized that they could save money, right, and they could also improve their reputation with the community, it really has taken off because there is a strong desire now from people to want to support businesses that are trying to protect the planet. And so we are encouraging anyone with a business that is already taking strides at reducing their use of any materials, not just plastics. And it could also include composting, because that's also part of the solution. So would love to see more people stepping up in supporting these businesses. They can go to the website, Plastic Ocean Project, and find out the list of restaurants and establishments that support this initiative.
Thank you so much. And may you'd like to add anything else before we go to the next presentation? Just maybe a description about some of the lab equipment you're running.
Yeah, I'd be delighted. So we have this microscopic FTIR, and it's such an incredible tool for most any area of research on plastics. And in fact, I was just in Alaska, and the team I was working with there were explaining that the grizzly bears are eating the plastic as well. They'll witness them ingesting them. So we brought back some scat to see if we could find plastics, and indeed we are. So the more we ask questions, the more we can locate where the problems are, and then really hone in on what those solutions are. So, I want to write a piece that says, how do you feel about grizzly bears eating styrofoam? Because styrofoam, I think, is one of the low-hanging fruits where we can all get on board that we should probably eliminate so much use of styrofoam. But the only way we're going to do that is to show the negative impacts. And that's the beauty of the work that we do.
Well, thank you for your attention to that.
Mm-hmm.
Did see one question from the audience asked for you to elaborate on how composting may reduce plastic pollution. I think you might be in referencing to some of the products that are compostable.
Yes, in fact, we're very fortunate here in Wilmington or New Hanover County that we do have a commercial compost system. And that's really the key ingredient if you're going to use compostable materials. So one of the downsides, of course, is what are the chemicals that are associated with that packaging. So that's where that research comes in. But yeah, the cardboard packaging can all go in the composter, and as well as paper. So there's a lot of benefits to not only using packaging that's made out of compostable material, but also it keeps it out of the landfill. And of course, the longer you can preserve your landfill, the better it is for everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Monteleone. For the audience, if you'd like to keep asking questions, I think she'll be online and might be able to respond. We'll be moving on to our next presentation, investigating microfibers by Dr. Richard Venditti and Dr. Marielis Zambrano from North Carolina State University. Marielis Zambrano holds a PhD in forest biomaterials and a BS in chemical engineering. Marielis has experience managing multidisciplinary teams in international organizations, in industry and academia. Sustainability has been the center of her career, and during her PhD at NC State University, she worked with an environmental hot topic, the plastic contamination in aquatic environments. specifically understanding the generation of microplastics or microfibers shed during the laundering of textiles and their fate in aquatic and marine environments. She did groundbreaking work on the impact of textile microfibers on the bacterial communities in natural settings such as lake and ocean waters, and the effects of textile finishes on cellulose-based fibers on their environmental fate. Marielis is passionate about promoting the circular economy in our society to create a sustainable future. Recently, Marielis joined Intrinsic Advanced Materials as a research manager. Dr. Richard Venditti is an Eli Stein Olson Professor in Paper Science and Engineering in the Forest Biomaterials Department at North Carolina State University. He has 26 years of experience in research in the areas of renewable materials from plants, microplastics from laundering, the bioeconomy, paper recycling, and environmental life cycle analysis. He is currently heading a multi-organization research project to understand the fate of microparticles from laundering in the environment. With that,
good morning. My name is Dr. Marielis Brander. I will present today with Dr. Richard Venditti from North Carolina State University a brief summary on microplastics. Microplastics, hidden threat. This presentation is done for the North Carolina Coastal Microplastic Forum. I will present today a brief overview of plastic pollution in the world's ocean, the sources and distribution of microplastics, what are the impacts of microplastics on the environment, what is the role of textile microfibers in this problem, and how these microfibers go to the environment, if there are any solutions for this problem. Plastic pollution in the world's ocean is a big problem in our society. We could say that the problem is just the plastic bottle or the plastic bags that we observe in the ocean, and that represents a big part of the problem. But there is another portion of the problem that seems to be very minor, just 11% of the weight of plastics in the environment. But in terms of particles and the surface area that these small particles have, they represent a big challenge because these particles are really hard to see and are really hard to recover from the environment. These plastic particles are called microplastics, and they are defined as any solid synthetic particle or polymeric matrix that is insoluble in water and that have size between 1 micrometer and 5 millimeters. They have regular or irregular shape, and they could be of primary or secondary manufacturing origin. So what that means is that primary microplastics enter to the environment directly in the form of small particles, and secondary microplastics are generated from the fragmentation of big plastic items. The main sources of primary microplastics in aquatic environments are synthetic textiles, tires, city dolls, road markings, marine coatings, personal care products, and plastic pellets. One of the main sources, as you can see here in the graph, is the microfibers that are released from textile during laundry or during wear and use. And only in the US and Canada, around 900 tons of microfibers per year make it to the environment via the wastewater treatment plants. This is equivalent to throw in the water 90 million plastic bottles in 1 year. Microplastics are basically everywhere, from the air, rivers, land, and even in deep marine environments. They have been observed in seafood, in beer, in tap water, in sea salt, and even in human stool samples. So that means that we are eating microplastics. The impacts of microplastics on the environment are not well defined yet, but these particles have a very high surface area, and they have a distinct surface chemistry that make them prone to interact with contaminants in the water, and they can transfer these contaminants or even pathogens to other trophic levels. The impacts in human health are not well understood so far, but there is a lot of information or research that shows that we are eating and breathing microplastics. In terms of aquatic fauna, there is more data available, and the microplastic can disrupt the digestive tract of the small animals, and they can disrupt also the endocrine system. And they can be mistaken by food, and these animals will eat microplastics instead of food, and at some point they might die. The problem in North Carolina is still not well understood, but at NC State, Dr. Barbara Dole and her collaborators are working on quantifying the plastic loads in the Neuse River Basin. They are taking samples all over the Neuse River and quantifying and classifying the macro and microplastics observed. This is an effort that is ongoing right now, and it involves a lot of work, and we hope that with this project there is more clarity on what is the status of microplastics in the state. In terms of what are the kind of fibers the kind of particles that have been observed in the environment, this recent research shows that fibers were found in almost 100% of the samples that were taken from different oceans all over the world. Most of these fibers that were observed were made of cellulosic fibers from textiles like cotton or paper, and animal fibers such as wool, or synthetic fibers like polyester, nylon, that they are by definition plastics. But how are these textile microfibers going to the environment? Where the main road for these microfibers to go to the environment is the washing effluents of the home laundry process. This effluence is rich in these microfibers or microplastics, and they go to the wastewater treatment plants in the base case scenario in developed countries. These plants, even though they are not designed for removal of microplastic, they retain a big portion of them, more than 98%, according to some studies. However, there are still small particle fibers of a small size, below 100 micrometer, that are passing through, and they are going to, with the wastewater treatment, influence to the environment. And the other problem is that the microplastics that don't degrade stay in the sludge, and this sludge at the end of the wastewater treatment process is applied to soil as a fertilizer. So we are moving the problem from the water to the soil now. But there is another source of microfibers, the airborne microfibers. These microfibers are also an important portion of the problem, and they can be generated during the drying process of your clothes. They can be generated during the wear and use of the clothes that you use every day, or they can be generated from the textile goods that you have at your house, like curtains or carpets or even furniture. For now, I will hand over the presentation to Dr. Venditti, and he will keep explaining this topic.
Thank you, Marielis. So the next question that we'd like to address is what happens to microplastics and microfibers, a subset of those, when they're in the environment. And really, it's important to know if they degrade or not. Are they compatible? We've done some experiments in our labs at NC State where we take ocean water, lake water, wastewater, and then we simulate the environment, and then we track the biodegradation. So here are what some of the results look like. And in this case, we put the microplastics into lake water. And what we see here is that cotton and rayon, which are natural cellulosic, which are based on natural cellulosic materials, they degrade readily within 35 days in lake water. So they're incorporated into the environment. However, in stark contrast, polyester and many other plastics are completely inert to biological activity. And so they persist in the lake water for a very long time. And that's one of the challenges of microplastics and microfibers. how long will they stay there, and what are the long-term consequences of this? Now let's talk a little bit about solutions. I mean, we all realize this is a major problem. Are there any solutions? And I would first start off by saying that the problem is very diffuse. So let's just take a fabric, for example. Over the life cycle of a fabric, you have microparticles coming off during manufacturing, during their use, during their washing, and then at the end of life. So microplastics can come out all of those. And then there's also other variables like fabric choice and how we wash it. And really, you can see that over the life cycle, there's not going to be one single solution. We have to kind of address the overall problem. So let's just talk about some technologies that have been proposed for solutions. First one I would like to mention is filtration devices or microfiber collection systems for washing machines. And these can be in the form of filters, balls that you put into the wash machine to absorb the microplastics, or even a washing bag where you put your clothes in and the bag contains the microfibers. Well, these are good. However, consumer acceptance is relatively low now, and they are somewhat tedious to use. And the other issue is, and on the right, we're showing some results of some of these traps. You can see that the removal of the microplastics from the water could be as low as 26% and maybe as high as 87%. So they're not 100% effective. Another thought is to how about using finishes on fabric? So basically the concept here is that when you have a fabric, it's soft because there's a flexible, loosely intertwined yarn that has microfibers in it. What if we added glue to those fabrics and then actually cemented the microfibers into the yarns? Well, we can see from this results here that the amount of microfibers shed per gram of fabric actually decreases as we start to add these finishes. The problem is that the question is, how do these glues or adhesives or extra finishes impact the properties of the fabric? For instance, the softness. We know consumers are going to make fabric purchases based on comfort and softness and other things like that. Not secondary would be microplastics and microfibers issues. Now, another solution is to replace synthetic plastic polymers with natural plant-based fibers that biodegrade. Two examples here are cotton and rayon. Each one of these, as you remember in my previous data, showed that they rapidly biodegrade in the environment, in an aqueous environment. And so that's a potential solution. And people are trying to replace plastics with paper products and cotton products and other types of cellulosic products in this attempt. When you get into trouble is when you try to match the same properties as synthetic polymers. For instance, grease resistance or comfort in fabrics or water resistance. So that's a challenge for using these. Now, the other option is that we use other biodegradable biopolymers. So polymers like PHB, PCl, PHBV, and you can see in this table here that they have very high extensive biodegradation in our experiments. Actually, some other biopolymers like PLA and cellulose acetates show relatively low biodegradability. So it's not, you cannot make a blanket statement that all biopolymers are biodegradable. The other thing is on the right here, I'm showing cyclo and polymateria, and those are additives that we put into synthetic polymers like polyethylene and polypropylene. And these additives are supposed to make the synthetic polymers more biodegradable. There's a lot more research and verification on the efficacy of these additives. So now I'm going to summarize what we've tried to explain today. First thing is microplastics are considered to be synthetic polymer type materials that are less than 5 millimeters, and they are increasing in the environment. So we detect them in the environment, and that's a global problem. Microplastics come from a variety of sources or origins. It can include fabric laundering, tires, city dust, paints, cosmetics, and even and many other things. So that's what makes the problem very difficult. Currently, we know that these microplastics have been detected in rivers and oceans, and therefore we see them in plants, animals, food that we drink, water that we eat, and even in humans. Another concern is that microplastics can be the carrier of chemicals and potentially toxic chemicals. So they're important in the fate of toxic chemicals in our environment. At this point, there's a lot of unknowns about microplastics. We don't really know what the effect on human health is of these microplastics. The other thing we mentioned was that of the sources, microfibers from fabrics are the largest leading source of these microplastics, and they can enter via the water or air. And then the other thing to think about is that because there's so many sources of these microplastics, there's not one single solution to the problem. People are working on solutions, but it's going to take a variety of different technologies to deal with this problem. And so really these technologies that are being developed that deal with fabric microplastics or microplastics in general, the challenge is how do we make these affordable, convenient, and also effective on a global stage? I want to thank you for your attention, and Dr. Zambrano and I are happy to answer questions at this point.
Dr. Zambrano and Venditti, thank you very much. I'd like to start our discussion by asking if you could define degradation for our audience members. Is there a point at which the fibers you're studying reach a certain particle size that you've considered sufficiently degraded?
Hello, everybody. Degradation is the loss of properties of the materials, right? So you lose a structure, you basically disintegrate the material. But that doesn't mean the material is biodegraded. So for the material to biodegrade, you need to get to the monomer or oligomer size. That means the individual unit of a polymer, so that the bacteria can take it and assimilate it and convert it to CO2 or methane. So if that doesn't happen, if you disintegrate, only degrade, you are creating actually probably more microplastics than indeed you are solving the problem. So the degradation is one thing, and biodegradation is the final stage.
Thank you. I think that segues into the next question. It was asked about whether the 98% efficiency to remove microfibers at wastewater treatment plants varied by locality, or is this a standard across the board?
It's not a standard. I took this from several studies that were performed in Europe, especially from a very good thesis that was performed in Finland. It seems from these reports that a secondary and primary treatment remove or retain most of the microplastics in the sludge, and the small sizes pass through, but also this will depend on what is the size of the filters that are used to isolate these particles. So like that's not a standard. The values will depend on what is the size, how you are retaining and recovering those particles. So at this point, most of the things, or the biggest things, over 100 micro, staying retained in the sludge, but this is applied elsewhere. So the problem is retaining the sludge and then apply to soil, so it never ends.
Right. Well, thank you both. And I think we'll hear a little bit more about the application of those biosolids later this morning. Thank you for your presentation.
You're welcome.
We've learned about microfibers.
Can I reply to the questions individually to the people?
Certainly. That'd be great if you could reply in the chat, just to keep us on schedule today. So what's in our rivers? We'll hear from Emily Sutton, the Haw River keeper, about microplastic sampling in North Carolina. Emily Sutton joined the staff of Haw River Assembly in 2016, managing citizen science projects to watchdog against sediment pollution and monitor the tributaries and main stem of the Haw River. As riverkeeper, she is now leading the fight against pollution in the Haw River on many fronts, including emerging contaminants, Jordan Lake nutrients, and sediment pollution. Emily grew up paddling rivers in the Midwest and moved to North Carolina to receive her BA at Appalachian State University in Sustainable Development, where she studied agroecology, watershed ecology, and outdoor education. Emily lives in Saxapahaw, North Carolina. I'll be talking to you about what's in our rivers.
Hi, my name is Emily Sutton. I'm the Haw River keeper at Haw River Assembly. And Haw River Assembly is a part of a larger group of North Carolina river keepers called Water Keepers Carolina. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this grant that we got in our project to monitor microplastics across the state. So most of us know about the sources of plastics. There are endless sources of plastics and ways that it gets into our streams. One that is talked about most often is individual practices like littering and individual responsibility, but that's really a drop in the bucket. That's not what we're seeing as the predominant source of litter. Our kayakers, our fishermen, our people that hike and play on the streams are not typically the ones that are dumping trash into the creeks. That definitely does happen, but really in the Haw, what we're seeing is the predominant source of litter in our waterways is stormwater runoff. So every time there's a major rain event, there's trash along the side of the roads or trash cans that get dumped over, and all of that eventually makes its way into our streams. Another major source is wastewater treatment plants. We've done a lot of monitoring upstream and downstream of wastewater treatment plants and are always so surprised to see the number of microfibers in our waterways. So that wastewater treatment plant effluent contains microfibers from laundry, from our clothes, from our fabrics, but also any kind of significant industrial user that's in that wastewater treatment plant system and discharge those tiny microfibers, microplastics, and they're not being removed in the effluent. Another source is industrial practices. We don't have this nearly as much in the Haw as communities in other parts of the state or other parts of the Southeast have. Charleston, South Carolina has had a huge issue with industrial practices, littering or discharging microplastics. There are these tiny little plastic balls called nurdles, and they're involved in all of these different plastic manufacturing processes, but they're tiny and they get discharged into the effluent, into the streams, and into the ocean. So anytime that we do research, we want to find ways that it ties to public health. Most people watching this presentation, I'm sure, have concerns about the health of the environment and wildlife as a whole, and the rights of nature and the rights of wildlife. But this is also a huge public health for human health concern. So the predominant way that this gets into our system is drinking water contamination. I've been shocked to find how much of this is also in our air and all of that, but this is getting into our tissues, into our bodies through drinking water. I'm sure that most of us have seen these horrifying reports about plastics in breast milk. And so this is in our bodies, getting into our infants through breast milk. And the concern about plastics in our tissues is one in its own that shouldn't be there. But the other issue is, what is the chemical compounds that these plastics are made of, and how is that impacting our bodies? And there's also been a lot of research to show that these plastics are soaking up other compounds. So in the haw and the Cape Fear, we have a lot of concerns about PFAS and 1,4-dioxane, and those compounds are also being soaked up by these plastic particles that are making their way into our bodies. Another big concern is fish and shellfish. I love to eat seafood, oysters, fish, mussels, crabs, all of it. And we know that these microplastic particles are getting into our foods. And then obviously impacts to wildlife is a huge concern. We've seen the videos of straws in turtles' noses and albatrosses that are filled with plastic, and all of these birds and whales and sharks that are just filled with plastic trash. So a little bit of background about Waterkeepers Carolina. All of us are our own individual nonprofit organization, but in North Carolina, there are 15 river keepers. There are more river keepers in North Carolina than any other state. So this is a map of all of our basins. Mine, the Haw, is right here, this little part of the Cape Fear. But there's a lot of us, and we are all very different people. We're all so passionate about water quality in our basins and also statewide. So we work together on a lot of statewide policy, statewide actions and projects. So if you don't know your riverkeeper, get to know them, get to know what we do. There's a lot of projects and opportunities for volunteering. Our grant that we got is so exciting. Our North Carolina Attorney General's office has an environmental enhancement grant program, and this year we got the grant to start a 2-year microplastic monitoring across the state. We're working with Bonnie Monteleone at Plastic Ocean Project to monitor for microplastics, and she has been working on a lot of coastal microplastics monitoring and ocean monitoring. But there hasn't really been a statewide look at how our streams are impacted by microplastics in North Carolina. So that's what this project is really focused on. Year one, we're just doing sample collection. Every other month, we collect surface water and sediment samples. And then year two, we'll be installing in-stream trash collectors. So we'll continue that sampling, but really focus on our advocacy at both the local level and the state level. Our sampling process has been a learning curve. We have been working with Bonnie Monteleone, and we've been so thorough about finding all the different procedures and quality assurance plans and everything we can do to prevent contamination of these samples. When I started this, I had no idea how prevalent microplastics were in our streams or in our air. And so it was really a hard process to figure out how to prevent air contamination from samples. So we're by looking at where the trash builds up in our streams. So each river keeper, we do cleanups, we work with volunteer teams. So we generally know areas in our watersheds that have a lot of trash buildup. For me, that's Durham. Durham's a very urban area and has a lot of public access to streams. So I have a location on Third Fork Creek, and we're monitoring upstream and downstream of where those trash traps will be located. And we know that the trash traps are not going to be taking out microplastics. They'll be removing macro, but we're hoping that by the end of year two, we'll have a noticeable difference because we're removing those macroplastics from breaking down, preventing that breakdown in the first place. So we're collecting surface water samples and sediment samples. Those surface water samples are collected in glass mason jars. We open it underwater, we rinse it, we close it underwater, so there's never any contamination from air particles. But this has been a trial and error project. It's been really hard to figure out how to transport heavy glass jars filled with sediment and water to Wilmington to get to Bonnie Monteleone's lab in Plastic Ocean Project in Wilmington. So there's been jars that have been broken, and we can't use any plastic packaging material or styrofoam packing peanuts or anything like that. So we've really been working to figure out how to transport these things safely. So this is our in-stream trash collector. This is called a trash trout, and this is a pretty picture to start with. We'll be getting 15 of these in January of 2022. So each river basin will have one. This is from Asheville Greenworks. They've been amazing to work with, and we are working with volunteer teams to clean out these trash traps each week. So we really want to prevent these things from overflowing and have any trash escape the system. So we're also working with Duke Law and Policy Clinic to collect a survey about the types and quantities of plastics that we collect. So if in Durham, I'm seeing mostly pieces of plastic bags or straws or whatever it may be, that will really inform our advocacy. We can incentivize and show the data to say what is the most effective policy that can be enacted on the local level or the state level. We'll continue sampling through the end of 2022 and focus mostly on our advocacy for what's the most effective use to prevent these things from getting in our streams. So here's another picture of the trash trout when it's full. You'll see there's a lot of storm debris in this. That's planned. These things are meant to withstand that. So these things are attached to beams on land, and these booms are meant to withstand high water and storm debris. This is a not permanent structure, so it does not require permitting from NCDEQ, but we are working with local stormwater programs and floodplain administrators. And for me working in Durham, those folks have been incredibly easy to work with. They're enthusiastic about getting this project started. These things typically run $3,500, so it's really easy for a fundraising project, and it's an exciting thing for volunteers and interns to get involved with. It's so rewarding to go out in the stream and empty these out and just see how much trash you prevented from polluting our stream. So as river keepers, we want to collect data. We want to show the issues in our streams, in our waterways, bring light to those issues, but really want to prevent these things from happening in the first place. We want to have long-term advocacy goals. So at Haw River Assembly, we have a lot of voluntary actions for both individuals and businesses. For individuals, we have all kinds of pledges that people can take about how to reduce their single-use plastic use. But really, that's a drop in the bucket. That's something that everyone can do, but a long-term solution to this is, of course, corporate responsibility. For businesses, we're fortunate enough to have a lot of great partners in the Triangle area, in the Triad area, that are using this in their business model. So one that I want to give a shout out to is Joe Van Gogh in Durham. They're a coffee shop that actually has an entire sustainability program within their business. And so not only do they no longer use single-use plastics, but they've come up with sort of a toolkit for how businesses can recreate that process. So cups that you can use, how to make the switch, what the cost difference is, how much you benefit from those changes. Another company is Fillery. They have a business model where their entire model is based on refilling these really nice metal bottles for house cleaning supplies, like sprays and soaps and shampoos and that kind of thing. Don't Waste Durham is another great program. Crystal Drystock has done a lot of research about how to have sustainable reusable bags and to-go boxes and make this an equitable program for everyone in Durham. Some other partnerships that we've had is with universities. So Elon and UNC Chapel Hill have both taken pledges to minimize or eliminate their single-use plastic use in the next 5 to 10 years. So that's an exciting thing. Our universities have a huge stake in how our state policies work. So we're hoping that all of these pieces together can push statewide legislative outcomes and local level bans and fees. So there's other folks here that are going to talk about the legislative outcomes, but there's still a lot of confusion of what is legal and what can be done because of that whole thing that happened in Manio a couple of years ago on the Outer Banks of the plastic bag ban. So there's a lot of misinformation out there about what's possible. Huge thanks to our partners. This would not be possible if we didn't have Bonnie at Plastic Ocean Project and the Trash Trout folks with Asheville Greenworks and Duke Law and Policy to help us navigate those tricky advocacy and legal questions that we get. Again, Water Carolina is our big network of all of our river keepers. Get to know yours, get involved. You do great work. And that's it. And I'm around for questions. Thank you so much.
Emily, thank you so much to you and the work of the Haw River Keepers and partners on this project to find out what's in our rivers. I was curious to learn more. If you are unable to use any plastic products to transport your sampling jars, what type of products are you using?
So we collect the samples in glass mason jars, and by now all of the companies that we're shipping with know us well. My group, the company that ships our samples in Durham, they pack it all with paper material, and so it's all like compostable paper. And they also double box it. So there's been a couple samples that have been, there was a wood crate that was made to prevent bottles from breaking, but all of us are using like paper material to package it.
Okay, thank you. And I saw you had responded in the chat, but just for our audience, in case they did not see it, could you elaborate on how those trash trouts avoid bycatch?
Sure. So the reason that we chose this design, there's a lot of in-stream trash collectors out there. So the reason that we chose this design specifically is that the grates on the cage are made of chain link fence. And so the holes are big enough to let out things like snakes that would get caught in it. But it also floats in the water. And so it's really only about 3 inches below the surface of the water. So any kind of fish, turtles, anything like that can swim under it, and it won't kind of impede that flow of water.
Okay. And we'll just go back to the sampling side of things. We still have a few time. Any feedback on use of metal containers instead of glass, and any of the plastic residual and mason jar lids might be a worry?
So, we haven't used metal bottles. That's a good suggestion. Mason jars were just things that we had readily accessible, and we've made sure to get lids that are unlined. And so all of us have glass mason jars that have lids that don't have any of the plastic or rubber lining. And then if they do, there's been some trial and error with lining it with tinfoil, and that kind of, it wasn't a good seal. And so we're just using lids that are unlined.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's great information for others who may be interested in doing sampling in their own waters.
And there's another question about sharing the results. This is all for the public, so we're absolutely going to be sharing all the results as soon as we get them. It's been really daunting for Bonnie's team to get a lot of samples in a huge database, and so that is, it takes time. So we're learning, we're getting all the results slowly, but as soon as we have them, it'll be public information.
Okay. Thank you, Emily. You might be able to reply and make sure it's being sent to all panelists if any future questions come in. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Susanne Brander at Oregon State University about what's in our seafood, microplastic impacts on the natural environment. Dr. Susanne Brander has been faculty at Oregon State University since 2017, after moving from the University of North Carolina in Wilmington, where she was faculty for 4 years. Brander's research encompasses the fields of toxicology, endocrinology, and ecology, integrating molecular approaches with measurements at the organism and population level. Brander's main focus is on the effects of stressors such as emerging pollutants, plastics, and changing climate on aquatic organisms. But her research and teaching also spans the links between ecological and human health. She's a PhD in toxicology and pharmacology from UC Davis and a master's in environmental science and policy from Johns Hopkins University. Although Brander has worked in academia for the past 6.5 years, following a completion of a master's and prior to pursuing a PhD, she worked in industry as an environmental analyst and project scientist at Weston Solutions. She's also worked briefly in the nonprofit industry. Her research is currently funded by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the National Science Foundation. She's presented on plastic pollution to the legislature in Salem and on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C.
Much for the opportunity to present today. My name is Dr. Susanne Brander. I am an assistant professor at Oregon State University in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences. And today I'll be talking about what's in my seafood, more specifically on microplastic impacts on the natural marine environment with a focus on commercial fisheries. And so I'll first walk you through a brief introduction. You've already heard a lot about plastic pollution from others earlier in the program. We'll talk about evidence in terms of global data as well as from North America when we're thinking about occurrence of microplastics in commercial fishery species with a focus on marine organisms. And then I'll give a bit of a summary and lead into next steps. So we, of course, have heard a lot about plastic pollution already today. We know it's a big problem. We know that it is impacting marine organisms, and then it has been for quite some time. It's a newer area of research, but really, of course, we've been making plastics since the 1950s, and they've been gradually increasing in marine ecosystems since then. We know that microplastics are transferred through food webs. They occur in both primary and secondary forms. Primary being things like nurdles that are used in factories to make larger plastic items. Secondary items are things that are breaking down, pieces that are breaking off of larger items, you know, from clothing, from plastic bottles, what have you, whatever your original source might be. These plastics are then ingested directly by organisms, but they are also trophically transferred, meaning that they are ingested by smaller organisms that are then fed upon as prey items by forage fish or larger predators. One example is an organism that we studied at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, in terms of a prey item for larval fish species. This is a tintinnid ciliate, which is a single-celled eukaryote that's widely distributed in both marine and freshwater ecosystems. It has a tendency to accumulate small microplastic particles on the order of 10 to 20 microns in size, and then can transfer those particles to a predator, which in the studies that we conducted was a larval fish. And of course, these particles are so small that the larval fish even doesn't necessarily see them as valuable prey items, but it ingests these particles when it ingests its prey. And the ultimate result is that these items can end up in seafood on our dinner plates, as shown in the figure here. What's less clear is whether there's a pattern of bioaccumulation. In terms of plastics that are large enough to ingest in the gut and then excrete, you don't see a pattern of bioaccumulation because those particles are only resident within the organism for a short period of time. What the jury is still out on is translocation, whether particles that are small enough to pass epithelial barriers and end up in fillet or other tissues that are more commonly eaten, whether those do bioaccumulate. So what about global trends? There was a meta-analysis that came out earlier in 2021 that looked at hundreds of different marine fish species in terms of whether they had been studied, for microplastic ingestion. This was all looking at gut contents, not looking at translocation or microplastics in other parts of the fish's bodies. And what they found was that 210 species of commercial importance have ingested plastic debris. The authors are calling this an evolutionary trap that is common, but not yet widespread, not yet universal. And across all studies that accounted for microplastics, there was an incidence of about 26% of fish, commercial fish species, having ingested plastics. The more concerning part of this is that the incidence of microplastic ingestion had doubled over the past 10 years. So how does plastic ingestion happen? And here I'm going to show you an example with a bivalve, because mollusks in particular tend to have higher microplastic loads. And in particular, mollusks collected off the coast of Asia are the most heavily contaminated. And this may be because sediments tend to be a sink for microplastic. So if you're comparing across taxonomic groups, you see that microplastic content can be as high as 10 or 11 microplastics per gram in mollusks, whereas in fish, on average, it's more like 2 to 3 microplastics per gram. And so those filter feeders tend to be intaking higher amounts. Often this happens during aquaculture, as the figure up here is showing. They filter in water, they absorb those microplastics, and then are, even if they're depurated in clean water, following culture prior to being sacrificed and sold on the market, they do tend to retain some of those microplastics. So what about this phenomenon of translocation, which may be influencing that issue of, even after depuration, of those mollusks still containing microplastic particles? Really, the study of translocation of smaller particles, even nanoplastics, which are too small to see without a scanning electron microscope, to edible tissues, is kind of the next frontier here to help us better understand human exposure and also better understand whether bioaccumulation of microplastics, of these very small plastics, might be occurring. There are limited studies on this, given the analytical limitations on finding and identifying these smaller particles. But a recent study did look at, over a long period, over 16 weeks, in European sea bass. They added microplastic particles that were 1 to 5 microns in size, so small enough to pass epithelial barriers within the fish, and then measured how much was showing up in the fillets. And on average, they were finding only about 0.36 particles per gram. But given that this was over 16 weeks, you have to think about what that means over the long term. And over a sea bass lifetime of 25 or 30 years, that could be more like 20 particles per gram. And to add to this, there was also a recent study done in canned fish, so mostly focusing on tuna, looking at tuna in everything from water to soybean oil to olive oil. And they also found that something like 80% of those samples had at least one microplastic particle, mostly fibers and fragments. The question about this study is whether those plastics that were contaminating those canned samples, whether they came from the fish themselves or whether they were introduced during processing. North America data are a little bit more sparse in terms of microplastic occurrence in commercial fisheries, but we are slowly filling those data gaps. Some recent work that's been done shows a number of different, kind of confirms a number of different trends that were already shown with studies up to 2019, which is when that North American review was published. A recent study in razor clams off the coast of Washington state shows that even in more pristine areas, so a lot of these clams are collected from reservations that are established along the coast there. They were finding that fibers are a common contaminant, and that some razor clams contain up to 6 or 7 fibers. A study off the East Coast in black sea bass found that contamination was much lower, at least in the gut tissue of these animals. And this was a study conducted at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, sampled fish in 2 different locations off the coast of North Carolina, and really found fewer than 1 particle per fish across a fairly large number. Over 100 fish were sampled from these different locations. Other studies, like one that was recently completed in black rockfish off the coast of Oregon in marine protected areas, plastic pollution is, it's more difficult to draw or to connect it back to a specific source, and it seems to be more ubiquitously distributed at relatively low levels, but at levels that are higher than what was found in, say, the black sea bass off the East Coast. Black sea bass has less than 1 particle per fish. Black rockfish off the coast of Oregon have more on the order of 4 or 5 particles on average per fish. So there's a lot of variability, and it points to the need for more studies on occurrence, because the more we know about what organisms are ingesting, the better we can assess risk. So just to give some examples of things that are found in wild organisms, this is an example of plastic. You can see over here, sort of looks like a transparent filmy thing, and this gives you an idea of how small it is. This bar is 0.5 millimeter in length, and so pretty tiny piece of plastic. And this is likely derived from a plastic bottle or something that is made from polyethylene terephthalate. And what this is showing is the spectra of this plastic item from a Fourier transform infrared spectrometer. So another common item that was found in this black rockfish study was actually not plastic, but it's still anthropogenically derived. It's probably a paper cup, akin to something that you would get your coffee in at Starbucks or your soda in at McDonald's. But we found a lot of items that were identified as paper cup cellulosic. So it's basically a paper cup that's lined with polyethylene or some other kind of plastic to make it waterproof. And this is an image that was taken by a research group at the University of Toronto, led by Chelsea Rockman. And you can see that a paper cup isn't exactly a paper cup. So what does this mean for humans? How much should we be concerned about the types of seafood we eat and how much microplastic might be in that seafood? And I think it's really important to remember that microplastic exposure via seafood is by far not the only route of exposure to humans. You can see that fish is over here, mollusk is slightly higher, crustacean is about the same as mollusk, but there's more variability, and a lot of variability in fish, probably because some of those studies were done in gut versus whole body. But you can see that air is the higher route of exposure. And so while we are ingesting some microplastics with our seafood, we're also getting them by inhaling them from the air as well. And what this graph down here is showing is the red is adult exposure and the blue is exposure in children. And those are roughly the same across those different sources. So to kind of sum things up, we know that 26% globally of fish species are found to ingest microplastics from that meta-analysis that was presented earlier on. And the amount of the percentage of fish in the US that contain microplastics is roughly the same. A study from 2015 found that 25% of the GI tracts of fish sold for human consumption in the US had anthropogenic debris, so very comparable to global estimates. Ingestion is increasing as plastic pollution increases. That's not a surprise. Fibers are ubiquitous across ecosystem types, whether they are near cities or whether they are in protected regions or areas. They're the most common morphology. They're easily transported globally. We need more studies on smaller particles with a focus on translation to typically eaten portions of seafood, and need to consider source reduction in the meantime. What are approaches we can take to reduce the amount of fibers and other fragments that are loading into marine ecosystems? What single-use plastics can we eliminate? And an additional thing to think about that I won't have time to talk about today is that we know that microplastics are a risk to us, so we do want to know what's in our seafood, but we also need to think about it in terms of what it's doing to fish populations. And as you can see from this graph here, we know that microplastics are toxic to fishes via numerous different routes, be it by affecting metabolism or immune response or respiration. All of these endpoints affect fitness, the fish's ability to survive and to reproduce, and that can have population level impacts. And so we should think about this from a human health perspective, but also from a fish health perspective. And in the end, that's going to influence how many fish there are out there to catch. So thinking about this from both angles is really important. And I'll finish up there with many acknowledgments to the many wonderful people and collaborators that I've gotten to work with on a number of different projects, including Bonnie, who you can see there, who is a speaker today. And if you want to learn more about work that we're doing currently, please visit pnwmicroplastics.org to learn a bit about outreach and research here at OSU and in the Pacific Northwest. Thank you so much for your time. Much for the opportunity.
Dr. Brander, thank you very much for informing us about what is in our seafood and elaborate on your research. I saw that you had answered one of the questions in the chat, but would like to bring it up for the recording. If you could explain the process for measuring the concentrations within the species you're studying.
Sure, can do. And can you hear me? Oh, wonderful, there it is.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, the question about measuring concentrations of plastics is a little bit complicated, and there are several ways to go about it. Many people use a particle count, which is useful because we're often dealing with mixtures. We're not ever dealing with one type of microplastic. And so this gives you an idea of how many particles on average across all different types are in your sample, water sample, biota, sediment, what have you. But that requires advanced microscopy sometimes, and also depending on how small your particles are, if you're getting down into the low micron size. And then also to get accurate counts, people sometimes use approaches like a Coulter counter, which gets complicated if you have a mixture. So often researchers will use a mass per volume, which gives you an overall estimate of what the weight or the mass of that plastic is in your sample. And there are ways to convert back and forth, and it's useful to have the measurement in both mass and particles per liter, because often toxicity testing is done in either or in terms of how those units are reported. And so it makes it easier for risk assessment purposes to be able to go back and forth between measurements from the field and exposures in the laboratory, so you can get an idea of what animals are actually responding to.
Well, thank you for clarifying the measurements.
Mm-hmm.
To go on to the next side of it, has there been a determination on the levels or concentrations that may be advisable for safe consumption yet?
Sure. And that is a process that is currently ongoing in the state of California. There's a working group I've been involved with that has been discussing this issue for almost the past 6 to 8 months or so. And right now the goals are to determine a potential screening level for drinking water, although that hasn't been determined yet. And then also to determine thresholds for ambient water. So this would be what marine or freshwater organisms would potentially be exposed to. Those numbers are still under discussion and haven't been finalized yet. What we do know is that for the most part, environmental levels currently are not at a level that is acutely toxic to organisms, but if we continue to dispose of plastics at the predicted rate, we may reach that level at some point. And so it's really difficult to assess risk at the moment because a lot of the studies that are available from the lab side of things are done on commercially purchased particles like polystyrene spheres, for example, whereas what we're finding in the field, as others today have reported, are mostly fibers or things like tire wear particles. And so we have a bit of a mismatch between data from the field and data from the lab, and that's what we're currently trying to sort of come to terms with and find agreement with in the process in California. And it's possible that the process that they're going through will then be used in other states. But we're working on it. Just long story short, the levels right now are probably not acutely toxic, but we need to use the precautionary principle and think about what future levels might get to.
The responsibility on it. And with just a minute left, if you might be able to expand on how these particles transcend different trophic levels.
Sure, absolutely. And I also saw a question about microorganisms in the chat. That's not something we study, but they are definitely affected. And there's a lot of good work being done, I believe, at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, looking at how microorganisms respond to plastic exposure. But in terms of how they transcend trophic levels, as I showed in one of my slides, we know that zooplankton and even really small unicellular organisms, protozoans like tintinnid ciliates, are able to internalize these particles. And then, of course, they are consumed by larger predators. Sometimes that larger predator is a tiny larval fish. And so this is happening at the base of food webs. And then they can be transferred upwards. Now, I did mention this in my talk. They don't seem to bioaccumulate, at least the larger microplastics, in the same way that persistent organic pollutants would, like DDT, for example. But they do transfer upward. They can cause harm in the period of time that they're within the animal. And then if the particles are small enough to translocate, there is possibility for bioaccumulation, although that is still being investigated, and sometimes we're a bit at the limit of our technical abilities, our analytical abilities with those smaller particle sizes. So you're talking about things that are mostly 20, 10 microns and smaller that would have the ability to translocate to other tissues that we eat.
Thank you for your responses and your attention to this matter affecting both the human and environmental impacts these microplastics are having. Thank you, Dr. Brander.
Great. Thank you for having me.
If you're learning about what's in our seafood, we'll learn more about what we're drinking. Microplastics' impact on human health, as discussed by Dr. Scott Coffin with the California State Water Resources Control Board. Dr. Coffin serves as research scientist at the California State Water Resources Control Board, where he performs research and develops drinking water regulations for microplastics and other contaminants. Scott completed his PhD in environmental toxicology at the University of California, Riverside, in which his research focused on plastics' effects on aquatic organisms. To learn more.
Hi, my name is Scott Coffin, and I'm a research scientist at the California State Water Resources Control Board. Today, I'll be talking to you about what am I drinking? Microplastics' impacts on human health. As you've learned from other speakers, plastic is everywhere and it breaks down into smaller pieces. Some of these plastic particles can enter our surface waters through atmospheric emissions and deposition, terrestrial emissions, and wastewater effluent. Once plastic is in water, it can fragment and break down into smaller pieces and become sediment. Some of this sediment can be resuspended and re-enter the water column. If a surface water source is used for drinking water, it can be taken up into the drinking water treatment plant, at which point some of it may make its way to consumers. First, I want to talk a little bit about wastewater treatment plants. The good news is that wastewater treatment plants are typically quite effective at removing microplastics. Between 88 to 99% of plastics are removed into sludge. The bad news is that you're probably wondering where the sludge goes. In many cases, sludge is transformed into biosolids and is used as a fertilizer. Biosolids are often applied in agricultural fields because it contains high levels of nutrients. It's not just California that uses biosolids, but you can see from this heat map, many different states tend to use biosolids, with Nebraska, Arizona, and Oregon using at least 76% of their sludge being applied back to land. Since plastic is sequestered into biosolids, one would expect that with increasing plastic production, you would find increasing concentrations in our biosolids. And this is actually the case. A recent study looking across all the way back to 1950 found increasing levels of biosolids, of microplastics in biosolids, which correlates quite well with global plastic production. So, what does this mean for our health and society? We know that plants can uptake and accumulate microplastics through their roots and be distributed through their shoots. What does this mean for our health? At this point, we don't know if plastic particles can make their way into the actual fruits and vegetables that we eat. However, we do know that with increasing plastic concentrations in soils, we see decreasing plant production of fruits and vegetables. With above a certain threshold, a complete inability of the plant to create tomatoes in this one study. Now, circling back and thinking about human exposure via tap water. In 2017, researchers found that microplastics they occur in many different tap water sources around the world, 83%. 94% of samples in the United States had detectable levels of microplastics. This prompted concern in the California legislature, which in 2018 passed Senate Bill 1422. This requires the California State Water Board to first define microplastics in July 1st of 2020, and by July 1st, 2021, we are required to adopt a standardized method for testing and analysis, accredit laboratories, consider adopting a health-based guidance level to aid consumers in interpreting microplastics levels in their water, and perform 4 years of testing and analysis and report concentrations of microplastics in drinking water back to consumers. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the standardized method, because if you can monitor for something, you can manage it. Currently, there are no standardized methods to monitor for microplastics in any matrix. To fill this gap, the California State Water Board is developing methods for monitoring microplastics not only in drinking water, but also in ocean water, fish tissue, and sediment. We have over 40 participating organizations involved, including government agencies, academia, instrument manufacturers, water systems, even a few plastic industry organizations themselves. This work we intend to complete by the end of this year, and we will publish the methods in academic journals. So moving on to another requirement from Senate Bill 1422, the requirement to consider adopting a health-based guidance level. So first, looking at the available evidence, a 2019 report by the Science Advice for Policy by European Academies concluded that the absence of evidence of microplastics risks currently does not allow one to conclude that risk is either present or absent with sufficient certainty. Another way of saying this is that we just don't have any evidence either way. To fill this gap, we're working with experts from around the world to weigh in on the available evidence and provide drinking water thresholds as well as ecosystem thresholds that we can base regulations on. We hope this work will be completed by the end of this summer. Looking back at the first study ever published on microplastics effects in humans, we can see a study published in 1960 finding that polystyrene particles can be taken up into the intestines and be distributed through tissue in mice. This suggests that particles These plastic particles are not just rapidly excreted and can be accumulated in our tissue, at which point they may cause harm. Between 1960 and now, we've seen a very few number of studies looking at microplastics effects in humans. And in 2019, we really started to see a rapid increase in the amount of studies published. In 2020, the total number of studies focused on humans doubled. So we now have an opportunity to reassess this new evidence. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the risks of exposure to microplastics. And risk is really made up of two components, which is hazard, in this case a shark or the potential to cause harm, and exposure. If you're not exposed to a hazard, there is no risk. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about exposure. When it comes to exposure, there's two factors to consider. How much is in the sources that we are exposed to, and how much variability there is in the population in terms of how much we actually ingest. Comparing across sources, we know that there's an extremely high variability in the occurrence in different sources where we might be exposed to. For instance, on the left here, you can see fish has 12 orders of magnitude of variability in the contamination. And this really has to do with where the fish is sourced, the type of fish, what's in their diet. However, when it comes to bottled and tap water, we see lower variability, and in general, we find higher concentrations in bottled water than in tap water. This is not surprising, as the bottle itself seems to be the source of these particles. Just unscrewing a lid from a plastic water bottle releases on the order of 14 to 2,400 plastic particles. This is not just plastic water bottles, but a recent study found that polypropylene feeding bottles for infants releases about 16 million particles per liter. This results in the estimated daily exposure of 14,000 to 4.5 million particles per day to infants. Again, this is just an exposure, and we don't know how much risk this could cause. Looking across all exposure routes and taking into account the relative ingestion, the relative exposure routes, we find that air is likely our greatest exposure pathway relative to ingesting all of the other potentially contaminated sources. This may come as a surprise to you. However, if you look at the household dust in your home, between 1.5% and 13% is actually plastic. And we find much higher concentrations indoor than outdoor air. And most of this is fibers that sheds off of our clothing, our upholstery, carpets, and rugs. There's so much plastic in our air that taking an average mussel contaminated with microplastics, so you put it on your dinner plate, by the time you're done eating dinner, there's 100 to 500 times more microfibers that have fallen onto the mussels that you've eaten than what was in the mussels to begin with. We know that microplastics don't just go away once we're exposed to them. It's estimated that we're walking around with between 525 and 9.3 million plastic particles. We know that these particles can be transferred to the next generation, with 4 out of 6 placentas containing microplastics in a 2021 study. So I've talked a lot about exposure. Let me talk a little bit about hazard. Plastic particles cause hazards in 2 different ways, through chemical as well as particle mechanisms. I'll talk about the chemical mechanisms. We know that plastic often contains hazardous chemicals. Many of these are intentionally added. There's at least 3,300 known chemical additives, of which 98 are hazardous, 7 are persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic, and 15 are endocrine disrupting. I've highlighted here in red the endocrine disrupting because I want to highlight these chemicals. On the left here is estrogen. Our body creates it naturally, but when we're exposed to higher levels than we need to be, it can cause things like diabetes, intellectual disabilities, and cancer. On the left here are 3 common plastic additives that mimic estrogen in the body. Bisphenol A actually began as a birth control drug and later was phased out, but now is commonly used in food contact products. Why do we care so much about endocrine disruptors? Exposure to just one class of endocrine disruptors, flame retardants, results in more intellectual disabilities than pesticides, mercury, and lead combined, with an estimated 750,000 to 1.75 million total intellectual disabilities in the United States between 2001 and 2016. Now that I've talked a little bit about chemical hazards, let's talk a little bit about the particle hazards. It's hypothesized that microplastic particles can cause reactive oxygen species formation. With prolonged exposure, this can lead to inflammation as well as cell death, which can lead to impacts to tissues and higher order health outcomes. Now that we know how plastic causes harm and how much we're exposed to, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the risks of microplastics, so combining those two elements of exposure and hazard. The best evidence we have for human risks of exposure to microplastics is from a medical literature case study on nylon flock workers. The finding of threefold higher increases in lung cancer in nylon flock workers in a Rhode Island plant relative to their non-worker cohort prompted further investigations, which led to the finding that inhalation of small fibers between 2 and 14 microns caused chronic exposure that led to inflammation and eventually led to lung cancer. This mechanism of toxicity was confirmed both in mice as well as in human cells. In summary, California is developing standardized methods to monitor for microplastics in drinking water, fish tissue, sediment, and ocean water, and will start looking for microplastics in drinking water in 2021. We will be publicly disclosing these results, and the data will be publicly available. While the human health effects of microplastics are largely uncertain, evidence is rapidly evolving, and we hope to have a better understanding of what's known and unknown through our health effects workshop that we will wrap up at the end of this year. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Dr. Coffin, thank you very much. To start things off, I'd like to ask if you could elaborate on how the California State Water Resources Board is developing methods to eventually come to a standard so that others may take that with and explore options for doing it in their own state.
Thanks, Michael. So, because there's no one way to analyze microplastics, we have initiated a method evaluation study with a suite of methods using three distinct instrumentation and allowing laboratories to perform modifications on the standard operating protocol as they see fit. And the way that we design the study is that each lab that has one of the three instruments follows a standard protocol, and then if they want to augment it with things that they believe can improve the method, they can do that as well in addition to the standard analysis. And so we have 40 different laboratories participating in this study, and we've been looking through the data and finding different modifications that can improve or decrease the accuracy and precision. And it seems like we have three methods that we feel quite confident are ready for use. So we have pyrolysis GCMS, effectively burning the sample and looking at the ions. You can tell what type of polymer it is. It tells you the mass, but it doesn't tell you the particle size or shape. We also have Raman and FTIR spectroscopy that give you a lot more information about the particles. It doesn't tell you the mass, but it does tell you the count and the size and the shape, but they tend to be a little bit more time consuming than pyrolysis GCMS.
Thank you. Setting a good example for other states to look after. I'd say at the individual level, with your awareness of this product, what types of measures are you taking to reduce your exposure?
I think the greatest way that we can reduce our individual exposure is just to reduce the amount of plastic that we expose ourselves to in general. So it seems like the opening of packages, whether it be a snack bag or a water bottle, tends to release quite a few number of plastic particles. And if you're ingesting that as part of a major part of your diet, then you could be getting the majority of your microplastics through ingestion through those routes. To reduce your inhalation exposure, you can remove extra types of plastic fibers in your home. So, maybe consider wood floors if you're buying a new house instead of carpet, as carpet tends to release quite a few microfibers over its lifetime. Also, the type of clothing that we wear, it seems like polyester and other synthetic textile clothing tends to release quite a few particles just through the act of wearing it.
Thank you for those suggestions. Going even further down from the individual to those who might be in utero, one of our audience members asked if there's been any research regarding infants who are exposed to microplastics through the placenta in some of those newer studies you referenced.
So at this point, we don't have any epidemiology evidence for human exposure to microplastics. There's quite a bit of evidence for the actual flame retardants and endocrine disrupting compounds, the chemicals, but the particles themselves we have very little information for. There are a very small handful of studies that have looked at impacts to developing mice and other rodents, but extrapolating that to humans, especially just looking at the one type of particle that they use, like polystyrene spheres, is quite challenging right now, and we don't know exactly what that means for human health.
Well, thank you for all this intensive research and setting the standard that others can look after. We appreciate it, Dr. Coffin.
Thank you.
I've heard from the California State Water Resources Board. Let's find out what others are doing in regard to regulatory and legal avenues for addressing microplastics. Hear from Sarah Morath, who is an associate professor at Wake Forest University School of Law. She researches and writes about environmental law and has written several articles on plastic pollution, some of which were recently published. In her book, Our Plastic Problem, will be published by the Cambridge University Press in 2022.
Hello, my name is Sarah Morath, and I'm a professor at Wake Forest University School of Law, and I'm excited to be at the North Carolina Coastal Microplastic Forum today, talking to you all about regulatory and legal avenues for addressing microplastics. A few considerations before we dive into the nitty-gritty. First, when we think about regulating microplastics or plastics in general, we have to think about where in the life cycle of plastic we want to regulate. So do we want to regulate the production stage? Do we want to regulate the disposal stage? Or do we want to regulate all of those stages in between? In addition to thinking about where in the life cycle of plastic we regulate, we want to think about who's doing the regulating. I think we traditionally think that that's the federal government's responsibility, and they're the folks who should be enacting legislation and regulating this issue, but also states and local governments like your city government can engage in regulatory activity, as well as the international community. So you might be familiar with calls for a global treaty to address plastic pollution. So that would be a legal avenue for addressing plastic pollution that would involve entities, countries at the global level. Businesses themselves, so someone who engages in plastic production, a business that engages in plastic production, or a distributor or someone who engages in plastic disposal, they can regulate themselves through self-regulation, or they might enlist the help of a third party. So say they set some sort of goal, I want to use this much less plastic in my product. They can either monitor that themselves, or they might ask for help from a third party to help them sort of come up with achievable goals and come up with a way to reach those goals, and then publicize that so that they can share with their consumers that they've achieved some sort of goal that they have set for themselves in terms of their plastic use. And then finally, we need to think about how we're going to go about regulating the issue that we see. And that can be through a couple of different ways, the direct regulation or the use of market tools or persuasive tools. So this next graphic sort of shows that spectrum between sort of this direct and hard regulatory instrument or tool that we might use, and that more indirect and soft kind of regulatory tool. And you'll see legislation uses all of these sometimes, or they might just focus on one kind of tool or a combination of these tools. So I think when we think about environmental issues and problems, we typically find ourselves focused in this direct hard. We have to ban this kind of plastic, or we have to set certain limits on how much plastic can be produced. We know from experience that those regulated entities really do not like to be told how to go about managing their product. And so you see sort of growing interest in using economic instruments like taxes or subsidies, as well as these persuasive instruments that would sort of offer funding or raise awareness about an issue. So looking at those three categories, some specific examples, the Microbead-Free Water Act is something that falls within that direct regulation, banning something, in this case, banning microbeads from beauty products like body scrubs and toothpaste. So that was enacted in 2016, 2017. It was a phased out approach so that eventually there would be no more microplastics in these products. The downside is that there have been a lot of microbeads that have already been released into the environment. The good news is that you can no longer go to the grocery store and buy toothpaste or body scrub that has these beads in them. Another example would be the Plastic Pellet-Free Waters Act, which was introduced in 2021 of this year, which would require the EPA to say you cannot discharge plastic pellets or pre-production plastics like flakes into waterways. Right now, that would be through the Clean Water Act. Right now, businesses, entities can release certain amounts of plastic pellets if they're in compliance with the permitting that they have received under the Clean Water Act. This would say, we don't care about what your permit says. The EPA is now saying you cannot discharge plastic pellets into the environment. If you do, you're in violation of the Clean Water Act. So that hard, direct kind of regulation through a ban or through some sort of target elimination standard. Economic instruments, we have seen this being sort of evoked in the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act, which would put a 5-cent excise tax on virgin plastic. So this is targeting the producer and saying, instead of using virgin plastic, perhaps maybe you want to use another kind of product, either recycled plastic or some other kind of raw material. And to do that, we're going to put a tax on the use of virgin plastic, encourage that sort of transition to some other kind of material. Taxes could also affect us as consumers. And so you might be familiar with bag taxes in Washington, D.C. or Chicago or Roanoke. There's a 5-cent tax on bags. And so the idea with taxes or these economic instruments is that we can use the market or we can use cost or price to change behavior, be it focusing on the manufacturer to kind of do its production a little bit differently, or focusing on the consumer and altering the consumer's behavior, encouraging them to bring canvas bags to the grocery store, for example. And then the final instrument, that more hands-off kinds of indirect, soft kind of tools, would be something like Plastic Free July, which is an education campaign to raise awareness about the harms of single-use plastic. And it's for individuals like us, you and me. We take a commitment to go plastic-free for a month. No one's making us do this. This is a choice of our own, just because we're aware and concerned about the issue. Labels are also these persuasive instruments where you as a consumer might purchase a product that has a label that suggests that it's less environmentally impactful, like something is 100% biodegradable. So these are examples of just sort of informing or educating the individual or the consumer and hoping that they make more environmentally sound decisions moving forward. So what is happening at the federal level in terms of plastic pollution? And so I've included a couple of examples here. I think you could look at other statutes as well, but these are ones that have been in the news or you might be familiar with. First is the Save Our Seas Act of 2018 and 2020, which is actually the reauthorization of the Marine Debris Act. And this Marine Debris Act formalized interagency coordination between NOAA and the EPA and a few other federal agencies to look at this issue focused on ocean-based plastic pollution. Look at that issue and kind of study it and report back on it. Funding was provided to encourage sort of innovation and further study on this issue. Because it had these non-regulatory methods, funding and coordination, soft, indirect, it received a lot of bipartisan support and had no trouble passing during the more contentious time of our Congress. In contrast, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, which was reintroduced in March of this year, has a lot more of those direct regulatory methods. We see extended producer responsibility provisions, the onus on the plastic producer to collect and come up with proper disposal processes for that plastic. You've seen EPR laws being introduced at the state level. Maine, Oregon, and Washington have just introduced some EPR laws. So this is an example of sort of state activity going on and maybe encouraging activity at the federal level or vice versa. The federal bottle bill, so that is this idea that the individual will return bottles if they are aware that they'll get some money back. So it's a market mechanism to encourage the proper collection and disposal of bottles. There's been a moratorium that this law would include a moratorium on the permitting of new plastic production plants. These, if you're familiar with sort of Cancer Alley in Louisiana, these kinds of plants are often located in communities of color, and so the moratorium would sort of allow more study of the harms associated with plastic production. And some bans of single-use plastics are also included in this Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. It's probably not going to pass because it doesn't have bipartisan support currently, but what does have bipartisan support are laws that concern recycling. I'm not going to talk a lot about recycling, but I just wanted to highlight a few that had been introduced very recently that address sort of improving our infrastructure for recycling, educating more about the importance of recycling, researching more about how we can recycle more efficiently, and those tend to get a lot of bipartisan support. And then finally, the Clean Water Act, which is an older piece of legislation from the 70s, but which could be used to address plastic pollution. It's also kind of unique in that it addresses land-based sources of pollution. So it's not focused on the ocean per se, it's focused on what kind of pollution that's happening on the land. And it can impose civil penalties on those who violate the Clean Water Act. And then how this might come into place with a plastic producer or manufacturer would be they have a permit under the Clean Water Act that authorizes them to discharge a certain amount of pellets, and they come out of compliance or they violate that, and then they could either be that could be enforced against them by individuals through citizen suit provisions or the federal government as well. And so litigation involving plastics is something that I think we're going to see a lot more of in the future. These are 3 cases that just in the past 2 years have arisen that address plastic pollution. The first 2 invoked the Clean Water Act and this idea that I was saying where you had a permit, and if you exceed the amount that's listed in your permit, you could be in violation of those federal laws. The first case settled for $50 million, and it involved a plastic producer, someone who sort of is creating the plastic. And the second case settled for $1.2 million and involved a packaging company. So not the producer, but they're sort of using and moving the plastic around. And so in both of those cases, the offending entity was violating their permit under federal law and were held to be liable. The final example is a more novel approach to target plastic bottling companies. This is a California provision. The California Consumer Legal Remedies Act is brought in state court. It's looking at public nuisance kinds of issues, negligence. You are sort of negligent in producing the bottle and putting it on the marketplace when you know that it's harmful and you don't really have proper recovery and recycling mechanisms put in place. That is ongoing, so we don't know the status of that just yet. But if I were working in-house counsel for a plastic manufacturer or a plastic packaging company, I would be thinking about the various ways in which I might be sued in the future, because consumers are becoming a lot more concerned about plastic pollution. And so I bet you will see in the future claims of fraud or product liability or toxic tort or property damage that are being lodged against producers and manufacturers. So if legislation at the federal level is not working and litigation is maybe not as active as we would like, we see these gap fillers that kind of fill in the space. We know consumers and individuals are concerned about plastic pollution and they want to see some action. So who are these gap fillers? Who can be filling the spaces when the federal government isn't acting? It can be states and cities. We talk a little bit about how they might fill gaps through sort of their own single-use bans or extended producer responsibility laws. We see something innovative happening in California. It's the only state right now that is using its Safe Drinking Water Act to look at microplastics in the drinking water, and it would require the State Water Resources Control Board to test and report on microplastics in drinking water. So that's happening right now. Like what the result is going to be has yet to be seen, but they're actually required to test and report on microplastics in drinking water. So that's kind of like a novel approach, thinking about how we might use drinking water laws to address microplastic pollution. Businesses switching raw materials, maybe using more recycled plastics, maybe eliminating plastic completely from its enterprise might be a gap filler of sorts. Also innovation, thinking about ways in which we can maybe collect fibers from tires or collect microfibers from washing machines. So we see a lot of research and development and innovation when it comes to sort of capturing microplastics when we don't have a lot of action or activity at the federal level. Institutions like zoos and universities and hospitals may be taking it upon themselves to say we're eliminating and phasing out the use of single-use plastics. And then finally, nonprofits and individuals coming together, gathering information through citizen science, educating others, creating partnerships with businesses and governments and other nonprofits to raise awareness on this issue. And finally, let's not forget, when we think about regulating this issue, about the disparate impact that plastic pollution has on Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, from production to disposal, and the UN just released a report on the environmental justice impacts of marine litter and plastic pollution. I look forward to your questions during the Q&A.
Ms. Morath, thank you so much for providing such a comprehensive overview of all of the both federal, state regulatory policies and the litigation that has been put forth. And what I would like to ask for our audience today is, what might you recommend that they do to help advance any of these policies or legislation that could be effective in reducing the microplastics problem?
Great, thank you. I think we've learned from this morning's session that plastic is ubiquitous. It comes in all different shapes and sizes. It comes in different forms. And it comes from different sources. And so I guess I would say that you can't underestimate the importance of just letting your local representative know that you're concerned about plastic pollution. And so I would encourage individuals not only to think about their own actions, but also to reach out to their senator or their congressperson and say, did you see that Maine just passed this law on extended producer responsibility? What are you doing about extended producer responsibility? I heard a podcast that interviewed a congressperson, and they said they became aware of an issue when they got like 10 letters, and that was it. And so I think just a few letters from individuals saying, what are you doing about this issue? Are you testing our drinking water for microplastics? It is enough to kind of let their elected representatives know that you as a constituent are concerned about this issue.
Do you think the extended producer responsibility is a more effective mechanism versus an outright ban on some of these products, since we just don't know what their impacts are at this point?
I think extended producer responsibility will get more bipartisan support because you're not talking about that hard, direct kind of regulation that tends to get a lot of resistance. And so we're saying you can still put it on the marketplace, but we're just going to put you in charge of collecting it and disposing of it. You're likely to bring industry along more than if you just say we're going to ban this product altogether. I think the extended producer responsibility is thinking about things in terms of circular economy, which we've heard a little bit about. And so thinking about how we can maximize resources and eliminate them from going to disposal is a good approach.
Hey, Ms. Morath, and any final comments as we are in our Plastic-Free July?
I think the more you know and the more you share, the more the public will become aware of this issue. I read a quote that said, "We're in plastic pollution right now. We are where we were 15 years ago with climate change." So we're still at the early stages, and we're still at that raising awareness and studying this issue stage. But the more you share and educate yourself about the issue, the quicker maybe we can come up with solutions.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We're going to transition from more of a presentation style to panel discussion. And for that, I'd like to introduce Adam Saslow, who will be our moderator for the panel discussion today. Adam is a policy expert, strategist, and builder of collaborative solutions. He's a senior facilitator at Kearns & West, bringing more than 2 decades of experience in public participation, community involvement, and the facilitation of multi-stakeholder groups. Adam has dedicated his career to creating safe environments for people to make their own best decisions. He's worked on complex and contentious dialogue, on sustainable materials management, and integrated solid waste management. His first collaborative dialogue was for the North Carolina Division of Coastal Management on the estuarine shoreline protection. And for the last 8 years, Adam has consulted to the US EPA's Trash-Free Waters program. Adam, thank you for moderating our panel discussion today.
Thank you, Michael. It's such an honor to be here with the Coastal Federation, as I first met Todd on my very first consulting project back in 1998. I've watched the progress, the power, the influence of the North Carolina Coastal Federation ever since, and I'm honored to have been asked to moderate this panel, in which we'll discuss what's next. I know it's going to catalyze some action. So thus far this morning, the Coastal Federation has taken us on a bit of a journey, the history of plastics and microfibers in our oceans and rivers, what we're seeing, what we're consuming in our food and in our drinking water. We've also just heard about the regulatory and non-regulatory and other legal pathways for moving the needle on this issue. But what can we do? To answer that question, we have 3 outstanding panelists today: Sarah Latshaw, Julie Patton Lawson, and Todd Miller. But rather than me tell you about them, why don't they tell you about themselves? Sarah, who are you?
Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Thanks, Adam. So yeah, thanks for that introduction, Adam. I'm the Southeast Regional Coordinator with the NOAA Marine Debris Program in Linker. I've been with the program for about 7 years now. And before working with NOAA, I was a project manager for the South Carolina Coastal Program, working on the State Adopt a Beach program and the Abandoned and Derelict Vessel program. I've lived here in Charleston for 15 years after moving here from Georgia, which I lived for about 12 years. And went to school at the University of Georgia. Go Dogs! Maybe not so welcomed here. Was also an education program specialist for the Georgia 4-H for several years too, before moving to Charleston. In all my education and studies, I really was drawn to kind of the impacts of marine debris and the 3 R's, of course. And so I felt really fortunate to be able to have a career in this field. I did want to just quickly tell folks about the marine debris program if they're unfamiliar with it. Just a really quick background that for those of you that don't know the marine debris program, we were established in 2006 by Congress, and we were established as the federal lead for addressing marine debris. And this includes large debris items like abandoned and derelict vessels and derelict fishing gear to the tiny microplastic debris, which is the focus of the forum today. So our program was amended in 2012 and then reauthorized in 2018. And we were given new authorities by the Save Our Seas Act in 2.0, Save Our Seas Act 2.0. And that was in December. And so we really focus on several areas: prevention, removal, research, emergency response, international coordination, and regional coordination. And so there's 9 coordinators like myself spread throughout the US and coastal territories. And we act kind of as those place-based staff in the region to better understand what's impacting our communities, because something in the Southeast that may be a lot different than the marine debris that's impacting Alaska or California. And so, as I mentioned, I'm based here in Charleston, and I work closely with many of you that are on the call today, and also work with a lot of groups in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And I can stop there, Adam.
Thanks, Sarah, and forgive the outburst. I lived in Atlanta for 23 years, but if there's any saving grace, so the Go Dogs thing resonates. It really does. But on the other hand, I have a rising senior in Chapel Hill, so we are officially a Tar Heel family. Let me turn to Julie Patton Lawson. Julie, I know you for years, but not everybody else here does. Who are you?
Hi, good morning. Nice to see everybody. Nice to see you again, Adam. My name's Julie. I work now for DC Mayor Muriel Bowser. I run a small office called the Mayor's Office of the Clean City, and our role is to coordinate work across 80 DC government agencies and a number of federal agencies to keep DC clean, safe, and healthy. We engage residents around litter pickup and prevention, and help other agencies with their trash reduction needs. We really run the gamut from helping our businesses make smart purchasing decisions all the way through collection and disposal, community service, and what the wildlife impacts are of plastics in our waterways. Prior to this job, I started, I was the founding executive director of Trash Free Maryland, that works to reduce trash pollution across the state through policy change and behavior change. I got into that work as a volunteer with my local chapter of the Surfrider Foundation, right when they got started with their Rise Above Plastics campaign back about 15 years ago. I really started getting engaged with policy making at the local level and really understanding that people protect the places that they care about, whether that's because you're surfing in the ocean and you're worried about plastic pollution in the waves, or you're worried about the illegal dumping in the alley behind your house. People will protect the place that they care about. And so I spent my career really focusing on getting people to do that, to where do you care about and how can we connect those two. I also serve as the chair of the Citizens Advisory Committee to the Chesapeake Bay program. So I have a lot of perspective around not just what's happening in DC and previously in Maryland, but what we're doing for the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed, which mostly overlaps with EPA Region 3 from New York to Virginia. So look forward to the conversation today and seeing what we can do to help North Carolina move forward.
Thank you, Julie. Now over to you, my dear friend, Todd Miller. I think everybody knows you, but say a few words.
Well, thanks, Adam. And I really appreciate all the participation from both our presenters today and all the attendees. So I'm the executive director for the North Carolina Coastal Federation. And I think my chief responsibility is not to get run over by my great staff that does all the work to put things like this together. And we've been working on the coast of North Carolina since 1982. And part of my connection to this work was the fact that I actually was born here and grew up in Carteret County on Bogue Sound. And it's interesting with marine debris, you think you can see these issues and follow trends, partially through the fact that you live in the environment and you're out experiencing it pretty much every day. With this issue, it's as we've learned today, most of it is pretty invisible, and what we see is actually only a small part of the problem. So it makes it a particularly tough task to get a handle on in terms of trying to figure out how to deal with it going forward. The Coastal Federation works on trying to advance public policy as it comes to managing and protecting our coastal resources and restoring them. We also have an active habitat protection and restoration program and water quality restoration program where we do on the ground projects involving many, many thousands of acres of coastal lands. And then we have dedicated programs doing environmental awareness and education so that as a population here, both of residents and visitors, we can do a better job at heading off problems that are so prevalent around the world. If we don't learn from the mistakes of others, we're doomed to repeat them. So that's basically where we are with the Federation. So.
All righty. Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome. Enough PowerPoints. Let's have a conversation. 30 minutes. Only one rule of engagement. Jump in, answer a few questions, and most of all, challenge each other. You're coming at this issue from different lenses, different perspectives, different types of organizations. Challenge each other as we go through these next 30 minutes. First question. We're all in this game, doing our own level best to keep our watersheds and oceans clean and plastic free. But we're in this game. Why should the average person care? I'm not calling you one by one, so just jump in.
I'm happy to start. I was just reflecting back on all the presentations that we heard today from excellent speakers. I did want to highlight that this has been a great webinar or forum that you guys put together. I've learned a lot, and I just think, the things that hit home to me and why I care is that it seems, as was mentioned before, as has been mentioned many times, it's ubiquitous. It's something that's in everything. Microplastics are in the air, they're in our tap water, in our bottled water, they've been found in sea salt, in our honey, and our seafood. And so just trying to better understand that, to understand, what are the consequences, I think are something that draws me to it, and I think probably others as well.
As we saw in some of the presentations, microplastics, well, some of them are primary pollutants where they are put into the water as microplastics. They almost all start as larger litter, which is much more visible to the average person, to everyone. Reason I got into trash in the first place was because it is something that literally everyone cares about, regardless of whether you're worried about the whales or, like I said, you're worried about the dumping in your neighborhood. It crosses all demographies and all borders. And I think to that point, it's also important to remember that water and pollution don't respect state lines, political boundaries, and really working at the regional level is important, but working at the local level with the people who are directly impacted by that trash on their street has an impact. And then as it spreads virally across communities, then you can start to see more of a global impact. We had done a lot of research, in the oceans, understanding the garbage patches and the gyres. And I don't have my props. I have my sample from the Atlantic from 2012 that the Five Gyres Institute collected. And I would walk this around Annapolis and show people, like, this is what we're talking about. This is when we talk about plastic pollution in the ocean, this is what we talk about. And one of the esteemed leaders of the House of Delegates, Maggie McIntosh, pulled me aside one day and said, that's great, I get it, but my voters don't care. They go to the beach once a year for vacation and they don't care about what's in the ocean. Tell me what's in the Chesapeake Bay. So we went out and we studied the Chesapeake Bay and we collected 60 samples across the whole bay, had them analyzed by University of Maryland and University of Toronto, published a paper on it last year. All 60 samples had plastic in it, and based on carrying around new jars that were from the bay, we could demonstrate the presence of microbeads coming out of one of the wastewater treatment plants, and we were able to pass the first strong law in the country to ban microbeads in personal care products. So getting to that, how do people really care, can directly lead to change and positive impact.
Okay, so I got stuck on something that you said. Essentially, early on, you said that you got into this because it's an apolitical issue. That it's kind of like the mayoral candidate who runs on the basis of fixing the potholes. There's nobody out there who wants potholes. Everybody gets behind. There is nobody out there who wants trash in our rivers, our watersheds, and our oceans. Nobody. It's an apolitical issue. Yet for some reason, it is so hard to pass legislation, to enact and implement policy. Where are the barriers? And how do we overcome them?
I'll just jump in real quickly. I think, we heard some wonderful presentations today, but there's always a gap between our scientific understanding and public policy. And it's efforts like this to try to speed along the connection between our scientific understandings and how that's reflected in how we manage our resources. We also heard today that, the science isn't complete yet. There's still a need for better additional science and better monitoring, partly to do what Julie mentioned and show people exactly what we have close to home in terms of this problem. And so I think, because it's a largely invisible problem, bringing it to life is going to be critical so that people understand the direct connection to their health and well-being.
To your question about what are the barriers, I think the biggest challenge that I've seen in 15 years of advocating on this issue is the question of who's ultimately responsible and who needs to be responsible. A lot of people will argue that it's personal, individual behavior, and people just need to behave better. We need to educate them more about don't litter. When in fact, we have manufacturers, multinational corporations producing something without a plan for how to deal with the waste at the end of the use of the product. And they're putting that burden on the taxpayer and municipalities to handle the waste at the end and to manage it. And that is one key thing that needs to change. I will say with the microbeads, we were able to get the personal care products folks on the record saying that they did not want to be putting microplastics into our waterways. And that was the game changer. Because if they could say that, then we could work together. We're all on the same page, like you said, on getting against potholes. So I think we are starting to see some corporations agree that we need to take better care of their waste that they're producing, but we still have a long way to go on figuring out who needs to pay for that.
Sometimes it takes a crisis. You said that we, in the past used examples of we needed to put the waste somewhere, wherever that might be. I'm not a big fan of public education. Those who have seen me speak before, know that there is that I don't need education to understand that this crumpled piece of paper doesn't belong on the ground. And investing in that doesn't excite me as the possible end game for this problem. What mobilizes people is a crisis, and we saw that back in the 70s, the advent of the Clean Water Act, and the Cuyahoga River was burning, and so the federal government moved. For microplastics and microfibers, if we don't have a Cuyahoga River, if the river's not burning, if even the Great Western Garbage Patch isn't enough to mobilize our policymakers, then what is?
I'll jump in real quickly. I mean, I think we've seen in recent history here in North Carolina with the emerging contaminants issue that the power of information. When it was documented that drinking water in Wilmington was contaminated with PFAS, the powers of the Clean Water Act were brought to bear to stop more of those discharges almost overnight. And state has invested heavily now and in the process of better understanding that issue and also starting to come to grips with it. I think we're, as others have said, we're still in the early stages of really exposing this issue to the public. And the things we heard today about opening a plastic bottle in which you ingest just from the cap, people knew that you're probably going to see a little more concern about some of these issues. And so I think again, we're at the stage that we know this is a problem that's not diminishing. It's about to explode as you look at the future trends. If we don't come to grips with it, we probably have enough information now to be scared pretty heavily about the consequences of what we've already done, and continuing to make that connection to people's health and well-being, I think is the key to getting effective government response in a systematic way. Not, as you said, personal responsibility can only go a limited way in dealing with this problem. So.
All right, so go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in, and also, I think that the field is pretty new to some extent, and there's a lot of unanswered questions still. But to your point about policy, I will say that the Save Our Seas 2.0 Act is something where Congress does see marine debris as important, and one of the focuses of some of the new mandates that came out of that was microfibers, in fact. And so there's actually a report that was charged to the international or the interagency coordinating committee that NOAA chairs. And so they asked for that report to be done on microfibers, and EPA is leading the development of this report. And so what that's going to include is the definition of microfibers, assessment of, the sources and prevalence of it, recommendations for standard methodology, estimate, and recommendations for what we can do in the future on the federal level as well. So I think there's more coming from this, and that there is some galvanization happening too.
Absolutely. And as Todd said, there's growing concern about the issues. The trend lines are pointing in the right direction, and there is fear out there as we get smarter and smarter and smarter. I don't mean to imply that there's no movement in the public sector. There is. It may not be as fast as we want, but there is. The theme of this being, this panel being, what can we do? Let's move into that realm for a minute or two. And Sarah, I'm going to come back to you. What's happening in the marine debris program on the microplastics and microfibers issue?
Sure, I'm happy to speak to that. So for the No Marine Debris program, I think we've been focused on this issue on more of a research level, as well as kind of raising awareness through public outreach and education. So early on, about 2008, we had the first international research workshop on microplastics, and that brought together research scientists from around the world to discuss the occurrence, effects, and fates of microplastics. And this was sort of new, and then in 2010, we held another workshop focused on kind of updating the state of the science since that 2008 workshop and really trying to clarify the risk. Both documents highlighted the main points of agreement, and then they also highlighted the gaps during that forum. And so these gaps the priorities that are identified from those that are really doing the work and the most experience are what helps guide our program to determine our grant funding priorities. And so, as I mentioned before, we have a couple of grant funding opportunities through removal, prevention, and research. And this is our main mandate from Congress, is how we try to help propel some of the science. As I mentioned before, you know, we focus on a lot of the microplastics research, or a lot of microplastics projects that we have been through our research funded projects. So we've had partners looking at impacts to the environment, distribution and abundance, and we're going to be moving into some new research projects that focus on looking at plastic and how it fragments and degrades over time. So that's something. And then as I mentioned, we chair the Interagency Marine Debris Coordinating Committee, and this brings together federal agencies to really kind of focus on the marine debris issues and talk about what everybody's doing, so that there's a lot of sharing and coordination going on. And so that committee is leading the way on that report that I mentioned on the microfibers. Another thing that came out of the Save Our Seas 2.0 Act is a report that Congress would like us to present on the U.S. global contribution to ocean plastic waste. And so while it's not a focus on microplastics, you know, in general, I think as we all learned, a lot of the microplastics that we're finding are from larger marine debris items. And so this report will be looking at our contributions, the United States contributions to waste, the prevalence of marine debris and mismanagement, examining the imports and exports of this waste. And this is being developed by the National Academies currently. And so with this report and the microfibers report, I think it'll give us a good overall picture of the macro and micro scale and future recommendations that we have. And then finally, I think one thing I'd like to highlight to you is that we have other funded projects that we support that have developed curriculum and educational resources in the past. And I'm happy to add that to the chat. You can find a lot of these resources on our website. And you know, some of them are good for informal educators. And so, you know, we're looking at all types of and sizes of debris, the projects that we do, but you know, all marine debris types are important and kind of help prevent the microplastics in the future too.
I've had the honor and the pleasure of working with the Marine Debris Coordinator Network from Maine to Tijuana, and I find NOAA to be incredibly relevant and in fact iconic in knowledge transfer, from workshops to science and research to putting out cutting edge information, grant funding, and more. Applaud your agency's efforts. Let's take that back to sure. I don't make this stuff up. It's great. It provides incredible value to those of us on the policy level, as well as those on the level of local thought leaders. And there are many who are grateful for that kind of support. Let's bring this back to DC and you know, trash-free Maryland. Your experiences, what's going on out there, maybe leveraging the expertise and information of NOAA or others. What's going out there on that state and local level, Julie?
Yeah, DC's been fortunate. We were able to, again, people care about the Anacostia River. So in 2010, we implemented the Anacostia River Cleanup and Protection Act, which was the first disposable bag fee in the country, 5 cents on plastic and paper bags. It's demonstrated a 70% reduction in bag use and in bag litter across the district. You know, we may be the nation's capital, but we're also 712,000 residents. And having that level of behavior change is really significant. We've also passed a district-wide foam foodware ban. Maryland recently passed, 2 years ago, a statewide ban that takes effect I think now. So we are seeing a lot on the side of source reduction. We've been exploring extended producer responsibility for packaging in order to target the last remaining major litter pollutant in our rivers, which is plastic bottles, to really take a hard look at the impact of them as litter and not necessarily disrupt our recycling of them, because that is fairly functional, but to really try to get at the problem of the bottle litter. I think one thing that has really been innovative in the Chesapeake Bay world is, when I got into this work, all of this $98 million organization, the Chesapeake Bay program, federal partnership across 6 states and and DC and a bunch of nonprofits, all guided by the Chesapeake Bay Restoration Agreement that all of these jurisdictions signed back in 1984. When I got into this work, trash was only mentioned as a stewardship activity, something we can get volunteers to go out and clean up trash, and that was it. And I was like, but it's actually causing water pollution. It has chemicals that absorb to it. Animals are eating it. This has an impact on all of the other goals that you've got across the Bay program. And in 2014, we were successful at getting it listed as an emerging concern in the agreement. And since then, we've seen even more work happening. And right now, the Plastic Pollution Action Team is wrapping up its work to produce a scientific environmental risk assessment for plastics. There are 2 documents coming out of this. One is just common definitions, getting everybody on the same page of what is a microplastic and how do we measure them and what are they, all the measurements and the protocols, and getting that all in one place. And then the other one is looking at the impacts, because the data is still so, there's still so many gaps in the data. It's really understanding the impact of microplastics on an iconic species in an iconic waterway in the Bay. And that's the striped bass, which is Maryland state fish, the rockfish, and in the Potomac River, the juveniles, so that they're not going out to the ocean, they're mostly living in that one place, and we can start to look at what is the impact of microplastics on this specific species. And that will get us a lot closer to understanding the impact that it can have on people. So I'm really grateful that the Bay program and the partnership have taken this as a priority and put a lot of scientific resources behind it, because I think that can be applied to a lot more regions around the country. And I hope NOAA and also our friends at Trash Free Waters and EPA will help share that word. We have been working with NOAA also on the Mid-Atlantic new marine debris action plan, where we're looking at, I'm specifically focused on consumer debris and leading the way on both policy and social science activities related to that. So lots of great stuff happening here, and we're happy to share all the information we've got.
Okay, so I had this burning question. Since I knew we were going to be on this panel together, I wanted to ask you way back when. You mentioned EPR and your work in the district on EPR. I just read that the state of Maine passed legislation on EPR. Very exciting. Is there a parallel here in how that may evolve? And I know we're looking into a crystal ball with this question. I'm kind of looking at Todd for this too. Is there a parallel between where we are at this early stage of state-driven EPR to where we were on microbeads when Illinois and New York passed legislation, and then all of a sudden it became federal policy? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I have been sort of a contrarian in this field for a while, where I don't actually think that a traditional bottle deposit is the best solution. A lot of people who are like surprised when I say that, but I think that there's a reason that most of them passed way before we had universal curbside recycling. And once you have the then you can lay recycling on top of it, but it's hard to do it the other way, because municipalities are their economics are so set up around it that if you disrupt it with a deposit system, you're siphoning off a lot of valuable material. So I have really thought, why do they keep failing? Adam, you said that, like, why are these things so hard to pass? And I said that it's because the different sides have different opinions on who's ultimately responsible. And by responsible, we mean cost. But Coca-Cola, not to name names, but doesn't want their bottles in the river either, because their label is on it and it's bad marketing. What is the solution that they can have in order to prevent that from happening? And how do we get them on the same page in a way that works? Bad laws work because grocery stores don't want to pay for them either. So the grocery stores get on your side. So yeah, we've really looked at the idea of in DC, extended producer responsibility, where the focus is on encouraging these large companies to make sure that their products with their labels are not ending up in the water as bad advertising. And we're getting there. A lot of people are, the companies are, we're working with the companies on what will work for you to solve this problem together. And hopefully we can start to minimize the vast outspending over, that happens during advocacy campaigns around this issue, where water advocates are outspent 100 to 1 on a campaign.
Yeah, Todd, I'm kind of looking at you. What's your thinking here?
Yeah, I think as Julie laid out, I mean, I wish there were simple solutions to this problem, but and I think part of the answer going forward is not to work on this issue in a silo. That it's really tied to a lot of issues we're dealing with, particularly on the coastal area of our state. And we're after this number of hurricanes, we realized that storm debris was a huge issue, and thanks to Sarah and Noah, there was some federal money initially made available to do some of the cleanups after that, but that actually convinced our state legislature to start investing in cleanups, and hopefully we're moving towards a reliable, ongoing program that we will get some of this large stuff out of the environment so it doesn't break down in the future. But as we talk about coastal resiliency and look at these pictures from the waterkeeper sampling, I mean, if you looked at the quality of that water, it wasn't just plastics that are a problem. The high turbidity water and the amount of sediment running off the land into those waterways. It's really part of a bigger issue of how are we doing in terms of buffering our environment from the impacts of population growth and intensive land uses place on it. And so I think we have to keep in mind that we need to keep that big picture in mind as we try to address this issue. In North Carolina, microplastics are just beginning to be part of the conversation with as we develop that conversation, I think we got to do that in the context of what are the opportunities to do better, which we have better streamside buffers, we have more effective stormwater programs. I mean, we're going to see multiple ways to reduce the problems that microplastics are causing.
Thank you, Todd. Sarah, it sounds like a call for help if ever I heard one. And frankly, when you're done with him, now that I've moved to the coast of South Carolina, come on down here, because after Elsa last week, we do have a bit of a mess here. Okay, I've taken you on this journey so far where we've gone from big picture federal to what's happening sort of at the state and local level, maybe. Let's get down to a personal and a more granular level before we close out. When we think about the microplastics and microfibers issues, I want to turn to each of you on this, and whoever wants it first can field it. What are you doing individually? What is the individual? What am I supposed to do here just south of Charleston to help abate this problem? What are you doing? You're the experts. And then there was silence.
I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, I was thinking about this a lot. I like to give kind of concrete examples of what everybody can do to kind of contribute. And so I can tell you some things that folks can do that I do on a personal level as well. But as we've mentioned, a lot of the microplastics are from larger debris items, so really stopping those items from getting into the water in the first place is important. Of course, reduce, reuse, recycle. And so some of the examples I like to use are, buying bulk, buy things with less packaging. So here I've really just tried to go room by room and assess what areas I can reduce waste. There's a lot of cool products out now that you can get to really reduce packaging and plastic in your rooms. And one of the things that we do internally at the National Ocean Service is we have a zero waste team that each year we have done, for the past couple of years, we've done a waste assessment. So I think people can do that on a personal level too. Just take a week and jot down what you throw away, what you recycle, and what you compost, so that you can get a better idea of the waste that you're producing. And then pick out ways that you can really figure out how you can do a better job at using less plastic. On the microfiber realm, I think there's some research out and some things that were mentioned of like purchasing less clothes or more durable clothing that lasts longer, washing less. So, I often will go out for walks or something if it's not too bad, although we are in South Carolina, but if it's not too bad, I'll rewear things. In this telework environment, I often have the same outfit most days. And then, there's some filter products that you can use on that too. One of the other things that I really love doing is I love to garden. I love plant plants and things. And there's a new study from San Francisco Bay that shows that rain gardens, another type of green infrastructure, has captured up to about 90% of microplastics from getting into the stormwater runoff. So I think if you need another excuse to add more plants to your yard, then there you go. I think that's a really powerful one right there. And then, of course, just getting involved in trash cleanups is a good step to keeping it out of the water in the first place. And we have a marine debris monitoring and assessment project where groups can sign up, or individuals can sign up for a 2-year period and monitor the same section every month. And this will give us a better idea of, what's the common types of debris and how often is it accumulating. And that data over time really helps to answer questions for researchers and how to create effective policy. So I have more, but I'll stop there because I know others want to contribute too. But that's some of the things that I'd like to share.
I saw a rain garden study out of California and had this vision of having my rain garden for 20 or 30 years and having it become a carpeted garden over time because of all the microfibers. Okay, Julie, next.
One thing I always tell people is, because we're usually doing these conversations with the choir, right? You already know the problem, you already care about it. The biggest thing that I think people can do is eat at home. It's been a little disrupted with the last year and a half, but with COVID, but 80% of the trash that we collect in our trash traps in the Anacostia River is related to food convenience. It's the utensils and the takeout containers and the plastic, not so many plastic bags anymore, but it's all that stuff that the food that you buy goes into, the processed stuff, the wrappers that you get at the corner store, all of that stuff. Like, just the more that you can cook for yourself at home and eat at home, you're going to reduce a lot of the stuff that you're throwing away that could, even if you didn't intend to litter it, could escape the system. I've also encouraged a lot of municipalities to think about putting rain gardens and bioswales into places that are trash hotspots, specifically for that reason of capturing them. It's a little bit hard to convince them about the maintenance piece, but I'm glad to see San Francisco saying that they're effective. There was one other thing I wanted to say, and now it's escaping me. But yeah, it just, I do all the regular things about my utensils, my bamboo utensils and my metal straws and all of that. and picking up the trash. Oh, that was what it was. If you're doing a trash cleanup, my strategy is I carry a 5-gallon bucket and a grabber, and then I can dump the contents of the bucket into a public can or into my trash can at home. And I didn't have to use an extra trash bag to collect it. It doesn't get as heavy either. And it's so reusable. And then when it gets dirty, you just close it out.
Great suggestions. And there's a bunch of things coming up in the chat room for folks who are interested in taking a quick scan at the ticker tape going by. Todd, over to you.
I try to listen to my kids who point out when I practice bad habits. So, and I think that learn a lot from, because we've done a good job of educating some of our youth to think about these issues. You know, quite frankly, I think, the most that I can contribute to this issue is through the work we do here at the Coastal Federation. And that, because we have a number of goals. I mean, talking about planting trees, we've planted millions of trees here on the coast. But it's influencing public policy and how we manage this issue that's going to be most critical. Again, I don't think individuals, unfortunately, can solve this problem. It's got to be a collective governmental response, and that helps individuals live a cleaner life. So.
Excellent. All right. I think what I want to do next is say thank you. Y'all are awesome, and I appreciate you going with these off-the-cuff questions and catching them all and hitting home runs, if I can mix a really bad metaphor there somehow on baseball. So thank you to all. Todd, one last question for you, and you wrap this up, you bang the gavel. What can folks in North Carolina do? This is clearly it's a global issue. It's a national issue. It's a local issue and a state issue. What can folks in the Tar Heel audience do moving forward?
Well, I think first we got to recognize it's an issue, and spread that awareness around so that it's, as with other issues, becomes not the outlier that recognizes it, but it becomes common knowledge. So that's going to be very important, and I think we're on our way, partly because of the severity of the issue that's going to happen. The states, I believe the state of Virginia, the governor passed enacted an executive order that focused on what state agencies could do to be role models on this issue in terms of their behavior and purchasing. I mean, I think we need to look at those opportunities in North Carolina to, where we can establish role models through either, legislative or executive action, that we get those high profile type activities going that, again, sort of set the proper example. As we've mentioned, I mean, there are existing authorities out there. We've seen that, with other issues involving the Clean Water Act, that once we really understand this problem, there's not a major legal impediment to doing a better job at how we write our NPDES permits and things dealing with municipal discharges, sludge management, what industries are discharging. I mean, if we know it's causing degradation of the quality and the productivity and the uses of our waters, there's a basis for action there. So, that's a job of citizens to make sure that we're bringing those needs to our elected and appointed officials' attention. But, I think we need to support the science and the further development of the science. The monitoring that's happening now is a great step forward. If our monitoring shows that this isn't a problem, then we can all clap and go home. But if it doesn't, then I think that will provide the foundation for meaningful action going forward. So anything we can do to help our academic community and others be better, have more capacity to help us document these issues, I think is critical. And it's wonderful to see, like, through this environmental enhancement grant program that the state attorney general has funded the sampling that the waterkeepers are doing. So those are all very positive steps forward.
Excellent. Would you like to close this out? It
Yeah.
is getting to the top of the hour.
Well, I mean, I think we've, between all the presentations, it's just been a great experience. I want to thank the Coastal Federation staff that put this together. They've worked on this for many months now. And this project was actually funded through donations from our Coastal Federation members to enable us to have the capacity to organize this and stage it. So I want to thank the staff and our supporters that have gotten us to this point. I think from the Coastal Federation perspective, we're going to step back and think about what we heard today and then come forth with a game plan. We're participating along with many others, including NOAA and many people here within the state, and a marine debris action plan, of which microplastics are one of the issues that have been set to try to get a handle on. So we want to advance that work, and what we've learned today is a step forward in us being able to do that. But again, it's been great participation. I've loved all the information running across the chat, and I think congratulate everybody that participated, which was not me, in organizing this to for a job well done. So.
All righty. Well, to the Coastal Federation, job well done. Appreciate the opportunity to share the stage with all of these wonderful people and the 120 to 160 of you that have been on the line throughout the last 3 hours. Thanks for all that you do to keep our waters trash free and plastics and microplastics where they should be. With that, farewell.